The rain fell in heavy sheets over Willow Creek, drumming against the wooden boardwalks and turning the main street into a river of mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the hastily constructed gallows that stood like a dark promise in the town square. The crowd had gathered, despite the downpour, their faces half hidden beneath the brims of sodden hats and dripping hoods. They came to witness justice, or what passed for it, in this corner of Wyoming Territory, 1879. The church bell tolled 7 times, each chime fading into the rumble of thunder. From the jailhouse emerged 3 figures, Sheriff Sawyer, his silver star catching what little light remained in the storm-darkened afternoon. Bishop Harrington Bible clutched to his chest like a shield, and between them, hands bound behind her back, walked a woman. Nadia stood tall despite her circumstances. Her dark hair hung in wet ropes down her back, framing high cheekbones and eyes that burned with an inner fire. She moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, each step measured and deliberate, as if she were walking to a throne rather than her execution. The crowd parted silently, some averting their eyes, others staring with naked hatred. No one spoke as she climbed the wooden steps of the gallows. The boards creaked beneath her bare feet, still stained with mud from her cell. Bishop Harrington stepped forward, his voice carrying over the patter of rain. "Nadia, known to some as the Apache Witch, you have been found guilty of the murder of Reverend Michael Collins and the practice of black magic against the good people of Willow Creek." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A child pointed at Nadia's face, where a single line of red paint marked her from temple to chin, a symbol no one in town understood, but everyone feared. "Have you any final words before God's judgment is carried out?" the bishop asked, though his tone suggested he expected none worth hearing. Nadia lifted her chin. Instead of pleading or cursing, as many had anticipated, she began to sing. The melody rose above the rainfall, ancient words in the Apache tongue flowing from her lips like water over stones. It wasn't a lament or a cry for mercy. It was a farewell to the earth, to the sky, to the mountains that had cradled her ancestors. Several women crossed themselves. A man spat into the mud. Sheriff Sawyer's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered behind his eyes as he stepped forward with the noose. "May God have mercy on your soul," he muttered low enough that only Nadia could hear. She met his gaze without flinching. "The Great Spirit already has," she replied, her voice calm and clear. "Can you say the same for yours?" The sheriff's hands hesitated for just a moment before placing the rope around her neck. He adjusted it with what might have been mistaken for care, then stepped back. Thunder crashed overhead as Bishop Harrington raised his hand. "For the murder of Reverend Collins by means of poison and witchcraft, for corrupting the minds of our children, for bringing drought upon our lands." "She ain't brought no drought," a voice called from the back of the crowd. "Been rainin' for 3 days straight." The interruption earned a few nervous laughs, quickly silenced by the bishop's glare. "The sentence is death by hanging," he continued, nodding to the executioner who stood ready at the lever. "May God forgive what we cannot." The crowd held its collective breath. Nadia closed her eyes, the song still on her lips. Then came the sound not of the trapdoor opening, but of hoofbeats, hard and fast, splashing through the muddied street. Heads turned, and the crowd parted once more as a rider on a midnight black horse thundered into the square. Jesse Blackwood sat tall in the saddle, his long coat spattered with mud, his dark beard flecked with raindrops. Before him, clutching the saddle horn, sat a small boy no more than 5 years old. The child's face was partially hidden against his father's chest, but his wide eyes were visible, taking in the scene with solemn intensity. Jesse reined his horse to a stop at the foot of the gallows. For a long moment, He said nothing, his gaze traveling from the bishop to the sheriff, and finally resting on Nadia. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Bishop Harrington demanded, his face flushing beneath his beard. "This is a lawful execution." Jesse dismounted in one fluid motion, lifting the boy down with him. "Noah," he said quietly, "stay by midnight." The child nodded, tiny fingers tangling in the horse's mane as his father ascended the gallows steps. "This execution," Jesse said, his voice carrying despite its softness, "is for a crime with no witness and no proof." "The evidence was presented at trial," the bishop snapped. "The jury found her guilty." "A trial that lasted half a day," Jesse countered, "with a jury of men who've never spoken a word to her." He turned to Sheriff Sawyer. "Is this justice, Sheriff, or is it fear wearing a lawman's badge?" The sheriff's mouth tightened beneath his mustache. "The law's been followed, Blackwood. I don't like it any more than you do, but my hands are tied." "Then untie them," Jesse said simply, "along with hers." Bishop Harrington stepped between them. "Mr. Blackwood, your reputation as a recluse is well known, as is your eccentricity since the passing of your wife. But this is beyond acceptable behavior. This woman is a murderess, a practitioner of dark arts." "My son hasn't spoken a word since his mother died," Jesse interrupted, gesturing to Noah, who stood silent beside the horse, clutching a rain-soaked teddy bear to his chest. "Not a single word in 8 months." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Everyone knew the story of Eleanor Blackwood's sudden death, how it had driven her husband to the edges of society, building a life for himself and his mute son 20 miles from town. "What has this to do with the execution?" the bishop demanded. "He needs a mother," Jesse said, his eyes finding Nadia's for the first time. Something passed between them, not recognition, not quite understanding, but an awareness. "And she needs a chance." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, growing louder as the implication of his words became clear. "You can't possibly suggest," the bishop sputtered. "I'm not suggesting anything," Jesse cut in. "I'm offering a solution. The law allows for clemency in cases where a condemned woman is claimed in marriage." He turned to the crowd. "Isn't that right, Judge Grant?" All eyes turned to Samuel Grant, a thin man with spectacles who had been watching the proceedings from beneath the shelter of the general store's awning. The judge cleared his throat. "That is technically correct. An archaic provision rarely invoked, but still on the books." "You can't be serious," the bishop hissed. "This is not some common thief or harlot. This woman is dangerous." "Is she?" Jesse's voice hardened. "Or is she just different? Are you hanging her for what she's done or for what she is?" The question hung in the air like the storm clouds above, heavy and threatening. Sheriff Sawyer was the first to break the silence. "The law's the law, Bishop. If Blackwood invokes the marriage provision and Judge Grant confirms its validity, we have no choice but to honor it. This is an outrage." The bishop's face had turned the color of a summer beet. "The woman murdered a man of God." "So you say," Jesse replied evenly, "yet no one saw her do it. No one heard Reverend Collins accuse her before he died. All you have is a cup of tea with herbs you can't identify, and the word of a man who's been trying to drive her from this town since she arrived." The bishop's eyes narrowed. "You're making a grave mistake, Blackwood. One that may cost more than just your reputation. Threatening a man in front of the law?" Jesse's hand moved slightly toward the revolver at his hip. "That's not very Christian of you, Bishop." Judge Grant stepped forward, clearly eager to diffuse the situation. "If Mr. Blackwood is invoking the marriage clemency, and if the accused is willing, then the court has no choice but to stay the execution. He looked up at Nadia, still standing with the noose around her neck. "Is this acceptable to you, Miss Nadia?" All eyes turned to her. For a long moment she said nothing, studying Jesse's face as if searching for a trap. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice soft but steady. "Why would you do this?" Jesse glanced back at his son, who stood watching them with those solemn eyes, clutching his teddy bear like a lifeline. "Because my boy needs someone who understands loss, and because no one deserves to die for being different." Rain streamed down Nadia's face, mingling with what might have been tears. She looked from Jesse to Noah, then to the crowd that had come to watch her die, and finally to the dark clouds above. "Yes," she said at last, "I accept." With those two words, the course of many lives shifted, like the weather vane above the town hall spinning to point in a new direction. Judge Grant nodded to Sheriff Sawyer, who stepped forward to remove the noose from Nadia's neck. The bishop stormed off the platform, Bible clutched so tightly his knuckles showed white. The crowd began to disperse, some disappointed, others relieved, all of them whispering behind raised hands. "The marriage must be performed immediately," Judge Grant announced, "to satisfy the law's requirements. Sheriff, if you would escort the parties to my office." As Sawyer cut the ropes binding Nadia's wrists, Jesse descended the steps and returned to his son. He knelt in the mud eye to eye with the boy. "Noah," he said gently, "this lady is going to come live with us for a while. She's going to be like new mother for you. Is that all right?" The boy didn't speak. Jesse hadn't expected him to, but he studied Nadia with those grave eyes of his before giving his father the slightest of nods. And so, as the rain continued to fall on Willow Creek, an unlikely trio made their way to the judge's office: a reclusive widower, a silent child, and a woman who had been moments from death. Behind them, Sheriff Sawyer watched with an expression that spoke of more than just professional concern. His hand strayed to a small pouch hidden beneath his vest, where a lock of dark hair tied with a red thread rested against his heart, a memento of another woman with Apache blood lost to him years ago. "God help them," he murmured to himself. "God help us all." The marriage ceremony, if it could be called that, was brief and devoid of sentiment. Judge Grant read the necessary legal declarations, Jesse and Nadia exchanged the required vows, and Noah stood between them, still clutching his teddy bear eyes, moving from one adult to the other, as if trying to understand this strange new arrangement. No rings were exchanged. No promises of love or fidelity were made beyond the formal words required by law. When it was done, Judge Grant signed the certificate with a flourish and handed it to Jesse. "This makes it legal," he said, his tone suggesting he was washing his hands of the whole affair. "But I'd advise you to keep your wife away from town for a while. Tempers are running high, especially with the bishop." "We weren't planning on Sunday socials," Jesse replied dryly, folding the paper and tucking it inside his coat. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Sawyer approached, keeping his voice low. "I'll ride out with you to the edge of town. There's been talk, and not the friendly kind." Jesse nodded his thanks. He lifted Noah onto the saddle, then hesitated, looking at Nadia. She stood barefoot in a simple prison dress, soaked through and muddied at the hem. Without a word, he removed his long coat and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture seemed to surprise her, perhaps the first genuine kindness she'd been shown in a long time. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Since before I could walk," she replied, a hint of pride cutting through her caution. They left town as they had entered it, Jesse and Noah on midnight, with Nadia now mounted on a bay mare borrowed from the sheriff's stable. Sawyer rode alongside them, one hand resting casually on his holstered pistol, eyes scanning the rain-soaked streets. Few people were out in the downpour, but curtains twitched in windows as they passed. From the shadows of the church porch, Bishop Harrington watched them go, his face set in lines of righteous anger. As they reached the edge of town, Sawyer reined in his horse. This is as far as I go," he said. "The road to your place is clear, far as I know, but keep your eyes open. Not everyone's happy about today's turn of events." "I'm aware," Jesse replied, adjusting Noah's position in front of him. "Thank you, Sheriff." Sawyer nodded, then turned to Nadia. Mrs. Blackwood," he corrected himself awkwardly. "I hope you find peace out there." Something in his tone suggested he meant more than just the words themselves. Nadia studied him, her dark eyes seeming to look straight through to his soul. "You carry a shadow, lawman. One day, you'll need to face it." Sawyer's weathered face betrayed nothing, but his hand instinctively moved to the hidden pouch beneath his vest. Without another word, he tipped his hat and turned his horse back toward town. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was made in silence, save for the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. The rain had eased to a gentle patter, and as they traveled further from town, the clouds began to break, allowing shafts of late-afternoon sunlight to pierce through. Nadia rode with the ease of someone born to the saddle, her back straight, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Jesse noticed how she studied the landscape not with the fear of someone fleeing, but with the careful attention of someone mapping escape routes and safe havens. It was the awareness of prey that had survived by avoiding predators. The road wound through rolling hills covered in prairie grass dotted with stands of pine and aspen. As they crested a final rise, the Blackwood Ranch came into view in the valley below, a sturdy log house with a wide porch, a large barn, a corral for horses, and beyond acres of grassland stretching to the base of the mountains. It wasn't grand by any means, but it was well built and well kept, the home of a man who took pride in his work, even when there was no one to appreciate it. "That's our home," Jesse said, the first words spoken since they'd left town. He wasn't sure if he was addressing Nadia or reminding himself of the new reality they were entering. Noah, still pressed against his father's chest, pointed toward the house with one small hand, as if welcoming Nadia to the only world he knew. They rode down into the valley as the last light of day painted the clouds in shades of gold and pink. By the time they reached the house, stars were beginning to appear in the patches of clear sky overhead. Jesse dismounted first, lifting Noah down before turning to help Nadia, but she had already swung herself off the mare with fluid grace. She stood for a moment, taking in her surroundings with those observant eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "The barn's there for the horses," Jesse said, nodding toward the structure. "I'll tend to them after we get settled." Nadia simply nodded, following as he led the way to the house. The porch steps creaked beneath their feet, and Jesse paused at the door, suddenly aware of the strangeness of their situation. He was bringing home a woman, a stranger to the house he had shared with Eleanor, to be a mother to the son who had lost his own. He pushed the door open, stepping aside to let Nadia enter first. The interior was simple but comfortable. A large main room with a stone fireplace, a solid wooden table with chairs, shelves lined with books, and a rocking chair near the hearth. A hallway led to what were presumably bedrooms, and a cast-iron stove stood in the corner that served as a kitchen. It was a bachelor's home now, functional rather than decorative, but traces of a woman's touch remained in the patterned quilt draped over the back of the sofa, the pressed flowers framed on one wall, the collection of painted ceramic birds arranged on a shelf. Noah immediately went to the rocking chair, climbing into it with his teddy bear and watching the adults with those quiet, assessing eyes. "You must be cold," Jessie said, moving to light the fire that had been laid in the hearth earlier that day. "And hungry, I expect." Nadia stood in the center of the room, still wearing his oversized coat, looking like a wild creature that had wandered in from the forest. "Why did you really bring me here?" she asked, her voice low but direct. Jessie struck a match, touching it to the kindling. "I told you, my son needs a mother." "He needs his mother," she corrected. "Not a stranger the town calls witch." The kindling caught flames licking at the larger pieces of wood. Jessie straightened, facing her. "His mother is dead. Nothing will change that." His voice held no anger, only a flat acceptance. "But he needs someone who understands what it is to be different, to be feared." Nadia's gaze shifted to Noah, who was watching them intently. "And what do you need, Mr. Blackwood?" Jessie didn't answer immediately. He moved to a chest in the corner, opening it to retrieve a blanket and a bundle of clothing. "Right now I need to tend to the horses," he said finally. "These were my wife's. They should fit well enough until we can get you something of your own." He placed the items on the table, then turned to Noah. "I'll be back soon, son. You stay here with—" He hesitated, unsure what to call Nadia in relation to the boy. "Nadia," she supplied simply. "Just Nadia." Jessie nodded. "Stay with Nadia. I won't be long." As he stepped back out into the night, closing the door behind him, Nadia and Noah regarded each other across the room, the woman who had nearly died that day, and the boy who hadn't spoken in months, two souls adrift in circumstances beyond their control. Noah rocked gently in the chair, the aged wood creaking a soft rhythm. After a moment, he held out his teddy bear toward her, its worn fur catching the firelight. It was a simple gesture, but in the quiet of that strange new beginning, it felt like the first tentative bridge across a vast divide. Outside, Jessie leaned against the closed door, drawing a deep breath of the night air. The storm had passed, leaving the sky clear and filled with stars. Their cold light fell on the barn, the corral, the distant line of trees, the boundaries of the world he had built for himself and Noah after Eleanor's death. A world that now included a woman who had stood on the gallows with a noose around her neck and defiance in her eyes. He pushed himself away from the door and crossed to the barn, his mind turning over the events of the day. He hadn't planned to go into town. There had been no reason to break his usual isolation. But Noah had pointed insistently toward the road that morning, tugging at his father's hand with unusual urgency. It had been the first real desire the boy had expressed in months. How could Jessie refuse? They had arrived just as the execution was beginning. Jessie had heard rumors about the Apache woman accused of witchcraft and murder, but he had paid little attention to town gossip. Yet standing there in the rain, watching her sing in the face of death, something had stirred in him, a recognition of the same fierce will to survive that had kept him going after Eleanor's passing. The decision to invoke the marriage clemency had come to him in that moment as natural and inevitable as the rain falling from the sky. Now, as he unsaddled the horses and brushed them down, he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. He knew nothing about this woman beyond her courage and her alleged crimes. He had brought her into his home to his son on nothing more than an instinct and a desperate hope that she might somehow help Noah find his voice again. "Eleanor," he murmured to the empty barn, "what would you think of what I've done?" There was no answer, of course. There never was, no matter how many times he spoke to his dead wife in the quiet moments when Noah couldn't hear. He finished tending to the horses and made his way back to the house, pausing on the porch to gather himself. Through the window, he could see Nadia and Noah sitting at the table. She had changed into Eleanor's clothes, a simple blue dress that was slightly too large for her slender frame, and had plaited her long hair into a single braid that hung down her back. She was showing Noah something with her hands, folding a piece of paper into shapes. The boy was watching with rapt attention, his teddy bear forgotten on the table beside him. Jesse felt a tightness in his chest at the sight. Noah hadn't shown interest in anything new since Eleanor died. He had gone through the motions of life, eating, when food was placed before him, sleeping, when put to bed, following his father around the ranch, but the spark that had made him a curious, joyful child had been extinguished. Yet here he was, leaning forward to see what Nadia was creating with those deft fingers of hers. Jesse took another deep breath and opened the door. Noah looked up at the sound but didn't retreat into himself as he usually did when his attention was broken. Instead, he pointed at the small paper bird sitting on the table in front of him. He wanted to see birds. Nadia explained, her tone neutral. I showed him how to make them from paper as my mother taught me. Jesse approached the table, examining the delicate creation. It's well made, he said, unsure how else to respond to this unexpected moment. Nadia studied his face as if trying to read intentions beneath his words. I've changed into the clothes you provided, she said. Thank you. Jesse nodded, suddenly aware of how Eleanor's dress transformed Nadia from the wild, defiant figure on the gallows into something more domestic, though no less dangerous, he suspected. Are you hungry? He asked, moving to the kitchen area. I can heat some stew. I haven't eaten since yesterday, she replied. It wasn't a complaint, merely a statement of fact. Jesse busied himself with the stove, spooning stew from a pot into a cast-iron pan to reheat. Noah climbed down from his chair and came to stand beside his father, a familiar routine in their quiet life together. There's something you should know, Jesse said as he worked, not looking at Nadia. This arrangement, it's not what you might think. You'll have your own room, your own space. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I'm not looking for a wife in the true sense. Just someone to help with Noah, to be a presence in his life. Nadia's voice came from directly behind him, startling him. She moved as silently as a shadow. And what of the town's expectations? Will they not question a marriage that isn't real? Jesse turned to face her, finding her standing closer than he had anticipated. Her dark eyes held his unblinking. The town's 20 miles away, he said. What happens here is no one's business but ours. And yet, you made it their business today, she pointed out. You challenged their judgment in front of everyone. Jesse's jaw tightened. I couldn't stand by and watch an innocent woman hang. You don't know that I'm innocent. Did you kill the Reverend? Nadia held his gaze for a long moment before answering. No, I tried to heal him with herbs when he fell ill. He died anyway, and they said I poisoned him. Jesse nodded, turning back to the stove. Then you're innocent. Just like that. There was a note of disbelief in her voice. You believe me without question. I'm a good judge of when someone's lying, Jesse replied, stirring the stew. And I know something about being wrongly accused. Before Nadia could ask what he meant, Noah tugged at her dress. Holding up another piece of paper, he wanted another bird. The moment of tension passed as Nadia knelt to the boy's level. This time I'll teach you to make it yourself, she said, her voice softening in a way Jesse hadn't heard before. They ate together at the table, the silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional crackle from the fireplace. Noah, seated between them, ate with more enthusiasm than he had shown in weeks, glancing occasionally at Nadia as if to make sure she was still there. When the meal was finished, Jessie showed Nadia to what would be her room, a small but comfortable space that had once been his workshop, hastily converted during their absence. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it's private. The washroom is down the hall. Noah and I sleep across the way." He handed her a small key. "This locks from the inside if you want that security." Nadia took the key, turning it over in her palm. "You trust a stranger accused of murder in your home, yet you give me a lock for protection." "The lock isn't to protect us from you," Jessie said quietly. "It's to protect you from the nightmares. We all have them here." And with that cryptic statement, he bid her good night and left her to settle in, taking Noah to prepare for bed. Alone in the small room, Nadia sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the key still in her hand. The events of the day washed over her, the gallows, the rain, the unexpected reprieve, and now this strange new life with a man and boy she didn't know. She had gone from condemned prisoner to reluctant bride in the space of hours. From facing death to being given a second chance at life, however uncertain that life might be. She crossed to the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. The same stars had shone down on her ancestors for countless generations, guiding them through times of plenty and times of hardship. They had survived. So would she. Nadia had just turned back to the bed when she heard a soft sound from the hallway, the creak of a floorboard beneath a careful foot. She tensed instinctively, reaching for a weapon she no longer had. The door remained closed, but she sensed someone standing outside it. Not Jessie, whose heavier tread she had already learned to recognize. This was lighter, hesitant. Noah. She opened the door to find the boy standing in the dim hallway, his teddy bear clutched to his chest, eyes wide and troubled in the moonlight streaming through a nearby window. "Can't sleep?" Nadia asked softly. Noah didn't speak. She hadn't expected him to, but he held out his bear toward her as he had earlier. It took her a moment to understand. "You want your bear to stay with me tonight?" The boy shook his head, then pointed to the bear, to himself, and finally to her room. "You and your bear want to stay with me," she translated. A small nod. Nadia hesitated. This wasn't part of the arrangement she had made with Jessie. The boy was supposed to be his responsibility, not hers. And yet Noah stood there in his nightshirt, small and vulnerable, seeking comfort from the very person his town had condemned as dangerous. She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in, then." Noah padded silently into the room and climbed onto the bed, settling himself against the pillow as if he belonged there. Nadia closed the door and returned to the bed, uncertain of how to proceed. The boy solved the dilemma for her by simply lifting the blanket, inviting her to sit beside him. When she did, he leaned against her side, his small body warm and trusting. It had been years since Nadia had been close to a child. Her life as a healer had involved mostly adults, the sick, the injured, the desperate, who came to her when conventional medicine failed them. Children had been kept away from her, their parents fearing contamination by her wildness or her magic. Yet here was this silent boy seeking her out in the darkness. On impulse, she began to hum a soft, low melody her own mother had sung to her as a child. It was a healing song meant to chase away bad dreams and bring restful sleep. Noah's eyes grew heavy as she hummed, his body relaxing against hers. Within minutes, he was asleep, one hand still clutching his bear, the other resting trustingly on her arm. Nadia continued the melody, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Outside, an owl called from a distant tree, once, twice, 3 times. A sign of change, her grandmother would have said. A new path opening. She gently shifted Noah to lay properly on the bed, then stretched out beside him, careful not to disturb his sleep. She would return him to his own room before dawn, she decided. No need to complicate things with Jessie on this first night. As she drifted toward sleep, Nadia wondered what forces had brought her to this place, from the gallows to a strange bed with a silent child seeking comfort in her presence. The Great Spirit worked in ways beyond understanding, her mother had always said. Perhaps this was part of a plan she couldn't yet see. Or perhaps it was simply the desperate gamble of a lonely man trying to save his son and a condemned woman with nothing left to lose. Either way, as sleep claimed her, Nadia made a silent promise to the stars watching through her window. She would protect this child as if he were her own for as long as this unlikely sanctuary lasted. Jesse woke before dawn, as was his habit. The house was quiet, the soft light of early morning just beginning to filter through the curtains. He checked Noah's room first, as he did every morning, and felt a stab of panic when he found the bed empty, the covers thrown back. He was halfway to Nadia's room, fear clenching his heart, when the door opened and she emerged with Noah in her arms, the boy still heavy with sleep, his head resting on her shoulder. "He came to my room in the night," she explained in a whisper. "Nightmares, I think. I was just bringing him back." Relief washed over Jesse, followed by a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. "He hasn't slept through the night since Eleanor died," he admitted, keeping his voice low. "He usually comes to my room." Nadia nodded, understanding in her eyes. Children seek safety where they can find it. She handed the still sleeping Noah to his father. "He's a good boy, strong spirit." Jesse cradled his son, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the sight of Noah sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. Nadia merely inclined her head, then returned to her room, closing the door softly behind her. Jesse stood in the hallway, holding his sleeping son, trying to process what had just happened. Noah, who had retreated so far into himself that Jesse sometimes feared he would never find his way back, had sought out Nadia, a stranger, a woman some called dangerous, and he had found comfort with her, enough to sleep through the night. It was both a blessing and a warning, Jesse realized. A blessing that Noah might be beginning to heal, but a warning of how quickly the boy could become attached to someone who had no reason to stay once the town's interest in her faded. This arrangement had been meant to save Nadia's life and potentially help Noah, but Jesse had not considered the complications that would arise when temporary sanctuary began to feel like something more permanent. He carried Noah back to his bed, tucking him in with his teddy bear. The boy stirred slightly, but didn't wake. His face relaxed in a way Jesse hadn't seen in far too long. "Sleep well, son," he whispered, brushing a lock of hair from Noah's forehead. "Things will look brighter today." Whether that was a promise or a hope, even Jesse wasn't sure. The morning unfolded with the awkward rhythm of three people learning to navigate shared space. Jesse prepared breakfast, a simple meal of cornmeal mush, bacon, and coffee for the adults' milk for Noah. Nadia offered to help, but Jesse had a system honed over months of managing alone that didn't easily accommodate assistance. So she sat with Noah at the table, showing him how to fold more paper birds while Jesse cooked. The boy was attentive, his small fingers clumsy but determined as he tried to mimic her movements. When breakfast was ready, they ate mostly in silence. Noah sat between them, occasionally looking from his father to Nadia, as if comparing them or perhaps wondering at this new arrangement. "I need to check the north fence today," Jesse said as they finished eating. "Storm might have brought down some branches." Nadia nodded, gathering the empty dishes. "What should I do?" Jesse hesitated. He hadn't thought that far ahead. In his mind, saving her from the gallows had been the extent of his plan. The practicalities of having another adult in the house, especially one with her particular background, hadn't been fully considered. "Whatever you're comfortable with," he said finally. "The house is yours to explore. There are books if you read. The garden out back needs weeding if you prefer to be outside." "I read," she said, a touch of pride in her voice. "And I'm good with gardens. The earth speaks to those who listen." Jesse nodded, not entirely sure what to make of such a statement. "Noah usually comes with me for morning chores, then stays in the house while I work the land." "He can stay with me," Nadia offered, "and if he wants to." They both looked at Noah, who was pushing the last of his breakfast around his bowl. The boy glanced up, sensing their attention, and pointed to Nadia, then to himself. "Seems he's made his choice," Jesse said, a mixture of relief and something like jealousy coloring his tone. "I'll be back by midday. If anyone comes, which they shouldn't stay inside." Nadia's expression darkened slightly. "You think they'll come for me?" It wasn't a question, but Jesse answered anyway. "Not today. Maybe not for a while. But eventually, someone will come to check that you're still here, still contained. Like a dangerous animal," she said flatly. Jesse met her gaze directly. "Like someone who threatened their comfortable understanding of the world." He stood collecting his hat from a hook by the door. "I'll be within shouting distance if you need anything." After he had gone, Nadia and Noah regarded each other across the table. The boy's solemn face revealed little, but his eyes were curious, assessing. "Well," Nadia said, rising to clear the remaining dishes, "shall we see what needs doing in this house of yours?" Noah nodded, sliding from his chair to follow her like a small shadow. They spent the morning in companionable activity. Nadia washed the breakfast dishes with Noah, drying the ones he could reach. She discovered a basket of mending by the rocking chair shirts, with missing buttons, socks with holes, a small jacket with a torn sleeve. Jesse's attempts at repair were functional, but crude, the stitches large and uneven. Nadia settled in the chair with the mending, showing Noah how to thread a needle and make tiny, neat stitches. The boy watched, fascinated, then tried himself on a scrap of fabric she gave him. His efforts were clumsy, but focused, his tongue poking out between his lips in concentration. As they worked, Nadia sang softly old songs her mother had taught her about the wind and the mountains, the animals and the stars. Noah listened, his eyes never leaving her face, as if he were memorizing every note. Later, they ventured into the garden behind the house. It was a practical plot, with rows of vegetables, rather than flowers, potatoes, carrots, beans, and corn struggling to grow in the hard Wyoming soil. Weeds had begun to take over in places, and Nadia showed Noah how to tell the difference between plants to keep and plants to pull. They worked side by side, the morning sun warming their backs. Nadia spoke to the boy as if he might answer at any moment, explaining the properties of different plants, telling him stories about the insects they uncovered. Noah didn't speak, but he responded in his own way, pointing, nodding, sometimes making small sounds of interest or surprise. He was more animated than Jesse had seen him in months, his natural curiosity beginning to reassert itself after being buried beneath grief. It was in the garden that Jesse found them when he returned at midday, both of them kneeling in the dirt, Nadia demonstrating how to transplant a seedling while Noah watched with rapt attention. For a moment, Jesse stood unnoticed, struck by the domestic scene before him. It was so reminiscent of Eleanor with Noah that it sent a pang through his chest, not quite pain, not quite longing, but a complex emotion he couldn't name. Noah spotted him first, jumping up to run to his father with dirt-covered hands. Jesse caught him, lifting him high before setting him back down. "Having a good morning, son." The boy nodded enthusiastically, tugging his father toward the garden to show him what they had done. Jesse followed, noting the neat rows where weeds had been cleared, the small piles of stones that had been removed from the soil. "You've been busy," he said to Nadia, who was still kneeling among the plants, her borrowed dress now smudged with earth. "The garden was neglected," she replied, not unkindly. "Plants need care to thrive." "Like children," Jessie said, watching Noah examine a beetle crawling across a leaf. Nadia looked up at him, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Yes, like children." There was something in her voice, a softness, a sadness, that made Jessie wonder about her life before Willow Creek, before the accusations that had led her to the gallows. He had saved her on impulse, knowing almost nothing about her beyond her courage in the face of death. Who was she really? What had brought her to this territory, to this moment in time? "I've repaired the north fence," he said, pushing those questions aside for now. "Thought we might have lunch. Then I need to work on the irrigation channel for the east field." Nadia rose gracefully, brushing dirt from her hands. "I made soup from last night's stew. It's keeping warm on the stove." Jessie blinked in surprise. It had been a long time since anyone but him had prepared a meal in that kitchen. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. They ate on the porch, the soup rich and flavorful, in a way Jessie's cooking rarely achieved. Nadia had added herbs from the garden, wild onions and sage, transforming the simple stew into something that reminded him of meals Eleanor had made in the early days of their marriage. Noah ate with enthusiasm, sopping up the broth with pieces of cornbread Jessie had brought back from the smokehouse where it had been cooling since the previous day. "You cook well," Jessie commented, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over them. "My mother taught me," Nadia replied. "Food is medicine," she always said. "It can heal the body and the spirit." "Your mother was Apache," Nadia nodded. "My father was white, a trapper who stayed with our band for 2 seasons, then moved on. I never knew him." She spoke matter-of-factly, without bitterness. "My mother raised me in the old ways, teaching me about plants and healing. When she died, I continued her work." "How did you end up in Willow Creek?" Jessie asked, genuinely curious. Nadia's expression closed slightly, her guard rising. "I go where I'm needed. A woman in a settlement near here had heard of my healing skills. Her daughter was very ill. I helped the child recover." She paused, looking out over the land. Word spread. Others came seeking help. Then the Reverend fell ill. "And they blamed you when he died," Jessie finished. "They were looking for someone to blame," Nadia corrected. "I was convenient, different, alone, without a man's protection." She glanced at him. "Until yesterday." The implications of her words hung in the air between them. Jessie had saved her life, but in doing so, he had tied her fate to his own in ways neither of them had fully considered. Noah, oblivious to the undercurrents of adult conversation, finished his soup and tugged at Jessie's sleeve, pointing toward the barn, with clear intent. "He wants to show you something," Nadia translated. "He's been talking about the barn all morning, in his way." Jessie raised an eyebrow. "Has he now?" "Well then, let's see what's so interesting in the barn, shall we?" Noah led them across the yard, his small boots kicking up dust as he ran ahead. The barn doors stood partially open, allowing shafts of sunlight to penetrate the dim interior. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and horses greeted them as they entered. Noah darted to the back of the barn where a workbench stood beneath a window. On it lay tools, pieces of wood, and what appeared to be technical drawings, Jessie's other work beyond the daily management of the ranch. The boy pointed excitedly at the drawings, then at Nadia. "He wanted me to see these," she realized aloud. Earlier, he was making gestures about water flowing. Jessie approached the workbench, surprised. The drawings were his plans for an irrigation system, a series of channels and pumps designed to bring water from the creek to the drier parts of his land. It was a project he had been working on for months, though he rarely discussed it with anyone. "These are irrigation plans," he explained somewhat guardedly, "a way to water the land more efficiently." Nadia studied the drawings with evident interest. "This is clever," she said, tracing the lines with a fingertip, "using the natural slope of the land to guide the water." Jessie felt an unexpected surge of pride at her assessment. "It's still just an idea. I haven't solved all the problems yet. Like how to lift the water to the higher ground here," Nadia observed, pointing to a section of the drawing marked with question marks. "Exactly." Jessie was impressed by her quick understanding. "I've been working on a pump design, but it's complex without proper materials." Noah tugged at Nadia's dress, then at his father's pants, bringing them together before the drawings, as if insisting they solve the problem together. Jessie and Nadia exchanged a glance, both amused by the boy's determination. "He seems to think we should collaborate," Jessie said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Children often see things more clearly than adults," Nadia replied, her own mouth curving slightly. "My people have been moving water across dry lands for generations. Perhaps I can offer some insights." And so, in the cool dimness of the barn, they bent over the drawings together, discussing angles and flow rates, materials, and methods. Noah sat on a hay bale nearby, watching them with those observant eyes of his, occasionally bringing them tools or pieces of wood, as if he understood exactly what they needed. It was the most normal Jessie had felt since Eleanor's death, engaged in a project solving problems, thinking of the future rather than dwelling on the past. And it was the most animated he had seen Noah, the boy's natural curiosity and intelligence shining through the layers of silence that had enveloped him. As for Nadia, Jessie noticed how she came alive when discussing practical matters, how her hands moved expressively as she explained concepts, how her knowledge of the land and its patterns revealed a deep understanding that went beyond book learning. For a few hours, they were not a widower, a mute child, and a woman rescued from the gallows. They were simply three people working together, building something that might bring life to thirsty land. It was a fragile piece, Jessie knew, one that could be shattered by a visitor from town, a resurgence of suspicion, or the inevitable complications of their unusual arrangement. But for now, in the warm afternoon light, filtering through the barn's dusty windows, it felt like the beginning of something worth protecting. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the yard, Jessie reluctantly called an end to their work. "We should head back to the house," he said. "It'll be dark soon, and there's supper to prepare." Nadia nodded, gathering the sketches they had modified together. "We've made good progress. The channel design is sound now. Thanks to your suggestion about using clay to line the channels," Jessie acknowledged. "I wouldn't have thought of that." They walked back to the house together, Noah between them, occasionally reaching up to take both their hands in his, a bridge connecting two adults who were still strangers in many ways, yet bound by their common concern for him. The evening routine established itself naturally. Jessie prepared supper, while Nadia set the table, and Noah arranged his paper birds as centerpieces. They ate by lamplight, the conversation easier than it had been that morning, focusing on plans for the irrigation system and work that needed doing around the ranch. After the meal, Jessie brought out a book, one of Eleanor's favorites, a collection of folk tales from around the world. It had been their tradition before her death to read to Noah each night. Jessie had continued it alone, though sometimes the memories made his voice catch on certain passages. Tonight, he handed the book to Nadia. "Would you like to read?" He asked, the gesture both practical and deeply symbolic, inviting her to take part in this small family ritual. Nadia accepted the book with careful hands, as if understanding its significance. She opened to the marker Jessie had placed a story about a clever rabbit outwitting a wolf. Her voice as she read was melodious and expressive, giving each character a distinct tone. Noah leaned against her side on the sofa, his eyes growing heavy as the story progressed. By the time she reached the end, he was fast asleep, his head resting on her arm. Jessie watched them from his chair by the fire, a complex emotion tightening his chest. It was both painful and healing to see Noah finding comfort with someone new, a reminder of what had been lost, and a glimpse of what might still be possible. "I'll take him to bed," he said softly, rising to lift the sleeping boy from the sofa. Nadia relinquished Noah gently, careful not to wake him. "He's exhausted," she observed. It was a day full of new things for him. "For all of us," Jessie replied, cradling his son against his chest. When he returned from settling Noah in his bed, Nadia was still on the sofa, the book open in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her face thoughtful in the lamplight. "Why did you really save me today?" she asked directly. "The truth, this time." Jessie sank back into his chair, considering her question. He owed her honesty, at least. "I saw something in you," he said finally. "Standing there in the rain, facing death without fear. A strength that reminded me of Eleanor." The name hung in the air between them, almost tangible. "Your wife," Nadia said. It wasn't a question. Jessie nodded. "She died 8 months ago. Everyone thinks it was childbirth fever, but—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "But you believe otherwise," Nadia finished for him, her perception unsettling. Jessie met her gaze directly. "I know otherwise. Eleanor was poisoned." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, seemed to change the very air in the room. Nadia's expression didn't change, but her posture straightened, slightly alert. "How do you know?" she asked quietly. Jessie rose, moving to a cabinet in the corner of the room. From it he withdrew a small wooden box, which he brought back to place on the table between them. "Eleanor was a botanist," he explained. "She studied plants, their properties, their uses. She kept detailed journals of her work." He opened the box, revealing a leather-bound notebook. The last entry she made the day before she died described symptoms of poisoning she was experiencing. She suspected it was in the tea delivered to her by a kind neighbor after Noah's birth. Nadia's eyes narrowed. "Did you tell the sheriff?" "I tried." Jessie's voice was bitter now. "Sawyer listened, but said there wasn't enough evidence. The tea was gone, Eleanor was buried, and I was a grieving husband looking for someone to blame." "Who delivered the tea?" Nadia asked, her mind working through the implications. "Mrs. Harrington," Jessie replied. "The bishop's wife." Understanding dawned in Nadia's eyes. "The same man who wanted me hanged." Jessie nodded grimly. "Bishop Harrington has been trying to buy this land for years. Says it would make a perfect site for a new church and school. Eleanor always refused to sell, even when I might have considered it. She believed in the work we were doing here." "The irrigation system," Nadia guessed. "It was her idea." "Her dream," Jessie corrected. She wanted to show that even the driest land could be made fertile with the right knowledge and care. She had discovered something about the water in the creek that runs through our property, some mineral quality that makes plants grow stronger, healthier. He closed the box, his hand lingering on its lid. "After she died, I threw myself into completing her work. It was all I had left of her besides Noah." Nadia was silent for a moment, absorbing this revelation. "So you saved me because I reminded you of her strength," she said finally. "And because you know what it is to be falsely accused." "Yes," Jessie admitted. but also because Noah needed someone who wasn't broken by grief, someone who could show him how to be strong in a world that isn't always kind. The honesty of his words seemed to touch something in Nadia. She leaned forward, her voice low and intense. "I will help your son, Jesse Blackwood, and I will help you complete your wife's work. Not because you saved me from the gallows, but because it's the right thing to do." She rose from the sofa, placing the book carefully on the table. "But you should know, the bishop won't stop wanting this land, and he won't stop seeing me as a threat. Sooner or later, he'll come for both." "Let him come," Jesse said, his voice hardening. "This time, I'll be ready." As Nadia turned to go to her room, Jesse called after her softly. "Nadia." She paused, looking back over her shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply, "for today, for Noah." And she acknowledged his gratitude with a slight inclination of her head, then continued down the hallway, her borrowed dress rustling softly in the quiet house. Jesse remained by the fire, watching the flames dance among the logs. He had shared his suspicions about Eleanor's death for the first time, and instead of dismissal or disbelief, he had found understanding. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the face of all that had happened and all that might still come. But as he sat alone in the flickering light, Jesse felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the faint stirring of hope, like a seedling pushing through hard soil toward the sun. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small dramas playing out beneath them. But in that house on the Wyoming prairie, something had changed. A new path had opened, a possibility had taken root. Whether it would grow into something lasting or wither under the harsh realities of their world remained to be seen. But for tonight at least, 3 lonely souls had found a moment of connection in the vast wilderness of their separate griefs. And sometimes Jesse thought, as he finally rose to bank the fire for the night, that was enough to keep going. One more day, one more chance, one more breath when you thought all hope was lost. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, as if the ranch itself was breathing easier with Nadia's presence. Mornings began with Jesse preparing breakfast, while Nadia helped Noah dress for the day. They would eat together at the sturdy wooden table, the silence punctuated by the clink of utensils and the occasional question or observation. After breakfast, Jesse would tend to the livestock and fields, sometimes taking Noah with him, other times leaving the boy in Nadia's care. Those were the hours when Noah seemed most animated, following Nadia through the garden as she taught him the names and properties of plants, or sitting beside her on the porch as she mended clothes and told him stories of her people. Evenings brought them together again, sharing simple meals and the quiet activities that filled the spaces between work and sleep. Jesse would often retreat to the barn afterward, working on his irrigation plans by lamplight, while Nadia read to Noah until he drifted off. It was on the 10th day of this new arrangement that Noah spoke his first word in 8 months. They were in the garden, Nadia showing him how to collect seeds from the ripening bean pods. The morning sun warmed their backs as they worked, Nadia humming softly as she always did when engaged in peaceful tasks. "These seeds," she explained, placing a few in Noah's small palm, "will sleep through the winter. In spring, we'll wake them up by planting them in the soil, and they'll grow into new plants." Noah studied the seeds intently, then looked up at her with those solemn eyes of his. His mouth worked for a moment, as if he were practicing the shape of words long unused. "Wake," he said, the sound barely more than a whisper, rough from disuse. Nadia froze, hardly daring to breathe. Had she imagined it? But no. Noah was looking at her expectantly, waiting for a response. "Yes," she said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "We'll wake them in the spring." Noah nodded satisfied and returned his attention to the seeds in his hand, seemingly unaware of the momentous nature of what had just occurred. Nadia remained still, watching him, her heart racing. Should she call Jesse? Make a fuss? No, that might startle Noah back into silence. Better to accept this gift quietly, to let him find his way back to speech in his own time. She continued working beside him, though her hands trembled slightly as she collected more seeds. Only when they returned to the house for lunch did she catch Jesse's eye and give a small, significant nod toward Noah. Jesse noticed something was different immediately. There was a tension in Nadia's posture, an intensity in her gaze that hadn't been there before. He raised an eyebrow in silent question as she handed him a plate. "Noah," she said carefully, "would you like to show your father what we learned about the seeds today?" The boy looked up from arranging his paper birds on the table, glancing between Nadia and Jesse. There was a moment of hesitation, a gathering of courage that Jesse could almost see like a physical thing. "Seeds sleep," Noah said, his voice small but clear. "We wake them." The plate slipped from Jesse's hand, clattering on the table but, miraculously, not breaking. He stared at his son, disbelief and hope warring on his face. "Noah," he whispered, kneeling beside the boy's chair. "What did you say, son?" Noah placed a hand on his father's arm. "Seeds sleep," he repeated a little more confidently. "Nadi showed me." "Nadi," Jesse echoed, glancing up at Nadia, who stood watching them with bright eyes. A nickname, a term of affection from a child who hadn't spoken in 8 months. "Yes," she said, simply understanding the question in his gaze. "In the garden this morning." Jesse gathered Noah into his arms, holding him tight against his chest. The boy returned the embrace, patting his father's back, as if to comfort him. Over Noah's shoulder, Jesse's eyes met Nadia's, filled with a gratitude too profound for words. Lunch was forgotten, as Noah, emboldened by his success, began to speak more single words at first, then simple phrases. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing a flood of language that had been building behind his silence for months. "Papa sad?" he said at one point, reaching up to touch Jesse's wet cheek. "No cry." "These are happy tears, son," Jesse explained, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm so happy to hear your voice again." Noah considered this, then nodded solemnly. "Happy tears." He turned to Nadia. "Nadi cried too." Indeed, Nadia's eyes glistened, though she blinked rapidly to clear them. "Yes, little one, happy tears." They spent the afternoon together, Jesse abandoning his work in the fields to simply be with his son, to hear the voice he had feared might be lost forever. Noah chattered intermittently, his speech sometimes halting or unclear after so long silent, but growing more fluid with each passing hour. By evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Noah had fallen asleep between them, exhausted by the emotional exertion of the day. "How did you do it?" Jesse asked quietly, careful not to wake his son. "We tried everything. Doctors' bribes, even threats at one point. God forgive me, nothing worked." Nadia shook her head, her gaze on the sleeping child. "I didn't do anything special. I just treated him like he could speak even when he didn't. I talked to him, not at him." She paused, considering. Children are like wild animals sometimes. They know when you're trying to trap them and they resist. But if you just sit quietly and let them come to you— Jesse nodded slowly, understanding. "You didn't pressure him." "No," Nadia agreed. "And perhaps he needed to know it was safe to speak again, that his words wouldn't bring more pain." The implication hung in the air between them that Noah's silence had been a response to trauma, to the loss of his mother, and the grief that had engulfed his father afterward. "I've been so focused on my own pain," Jesse admitted, his voice barely audible over the evening chorus of crickets. "On completing Eleanor's work on keeping this land. I didn't see how much Noah was hurting too." "You were both hurting," Nadia corrected gently. "Grief isn't something you can measure or compare. It just is." Jesse studied her face in the fading light, struck by the wisdom in her words. "You've known loss, too," he observed. Nadia nodded, her eyes distant. "My mother, my home, my place in the world." She looked down at Noah, her expression softening. "But there is always new growth, even after fire has swept through the forest." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, the first stars appearing in the eastern sky. Jesse carried Noah to bed when the air grew chill, returning to find Nadia still on the porch, gazing up at the night sky. "Thank you," he said simply, taking his seat beside her again, "for whatever part you played in bringing him back to me." Nadia acknowledged his gratitude with a slight inclination of her head, her profile elegant in the silvery moonlight. "He was never gone," she said, "just waiting for the right moment to return." Jesse wanted to say more, to express the debt he felt he owed her, the change she had brought to their isolated existence, but the words seemed inadequate. Instead, he sat beside her in the darkness, sharing the moment of quiet triumph, of cautious hope. It was enough for now. The following days brought more progress. Noah spoke more readily, his vocabulary expanding as he reclaimed the language skills that had lain dormant. He began to ask questions, endless questions about everything he saw, as if making up for the months of silent wondering. "Why is the sky blue, Papa? Where do clouds go at night, Nadi? Does the moon get lonely without the sun?" Jesse and Nadia answered as best they could, sometimes consulting Eleanor's books for more accurate explanations than they could provide alone. These sessions often evolved into impromptu lessons, with Nadia teaching Noah words in the Apache language, and Jesse explaining the principles of mechanics or agriculture. It was during one such lesson, as they sat at the kitchen table surrounded by books and Noah's drawings, that they heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Jesse was on his feet immediately, his hand moving to the rifle mounted above the door. "Stay inside," he instructed, his voice tense. "Both of you." Nadia gathered Noah closer instinctively, shielding him with her body as Jesse stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. A lone rider approached from the east, Sheriff Sawyer, his badge catching the midday sun as he drew closer. Jesse lowered his weapon slightly, but didn't put it away entirely. The sheriff's arrival could mean many things, few of them good. Sawyer reined in his horse at a respectful distance, raising one hand in greeting. "Afternoon, Blackwood," he called. "Mind if I water my horse? Been a long ride from town." Jesse nodded curtly, gesturing toward the well. "Help yourself." The sheriff dismounted, leading his horse to the water trough. He moved with the deliberate calm of a man accustomed to diffusing tense situations. "Fine day," he commented, glancing at the clear blue sky overhead. "Crops looking good." "What brings you out this way, Sheriff?" Jesse asked, ignoring the attempt at casual conversation. "Town's sending you to check I'm keeping my end of the bargain." Sawyer sighed, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "Can we talk inside? What I've got to say shouldn't be discussed in the open." Jesse hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Leave your sidearm on the porch." The sheriff complied without argument, placing his revolver on the railing before following Jesse into the house. Nadia stood by the table, her posture rigid, one hand resting protectively on Noah's shoulder. The boy watched the newcomer with wide, curious eyes. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sawyer greeted her, inclining his head respectfully. And young Noah, good to see you both. Sheriff, Nadia acknowledged, her tone neutral. Jesse gestured for Sawyer to sit at the table. Say what you came to say. The sheriff settled into a chair, placing his hat before him. His weathered face was grave as he looked from Jesse to Nadia. There's trouble brewing in town, he said without preamble. Bishop Harrington's been stirring things up, saying the marriage isn't legitimate, that you've broken God's law by harboring a witch. Jesse's jaw tightened. The marriage is legal. Judge Grant performed it himself. Legal, yes, Sawyer agreed. But the bishop's appealing to a higher authority, so to speak. He's been preaching about the dangers of mixing with heathens and savages. Says you've put the whole community at risk. Nadia's expression remained impassive, but Jesse saw how her fingers tightened on Noah's shoulder. Why are you telling us this? She asked. To warn us, or to prepare us for when you come with a posse to drag me back to the gallows. Sawyer met her gaze directly. I'm telling you, because I don't want to see another innocent person hanged in my town. Because I've seen what hatred and fear can do, and I don't want that blood on my hands again. There was something in his voice, a rawness, a pain long buried but never truly healed, that made Jesse look at the sheriff with new eyes. Again, he echoed. Sawyer's gaze dropped to his hat, his fingers tracing the worn brim. My wife, he said quietly. Her name was Maria. Half Apache like you, Mrs. Blackwood. The town drove her out 15 years ago during a drought. Said she was cursing the land, bringing bad fortune. His voice grew hoarse. I was a deputy then, new to the job, too afraid to stand against the town elders. By the time I found my courage and went after her, winter had set in. She didn't survive. The revelation hung in the air, reshaping their understanding of the quiet, dutiful lawman who had stood by during Nadia's near execution. I'm sorry, Nadia said softly, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight of understanding that transcended conventional sympathy. Sawyer nodded, accepting her words for what they were. I've spent 15 years enforcing laws I don't always believe in, trying to keep the peace in a town built on stolen land and stolen lives. It's not much of an atonement. He looked up, his eyes meeting Jesse's. But I can warn you when trouble's coming. And it is coming, Blackwood. Sooner rather than later. What kind of trouble? Jesse asked, his mind already calculating ammunition to be checked, escape routes to be planned. Harrington's gathered a group of men, the kind who enjoy having an excuse for violence, Sawyer explained. They've been meeting at the old saloon after dark, drinking, talking big about cleaning up the territory, and your name comes up a lot. Just talk so far, Jesse pressed. For now, Sawyer confirmed, but talk like that has a way of turning into action when men have liquor in them and guns on their hips. Noah, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. Bad men coming? He asked, looking from his father to the sheriff. Sawyer's eyebrows rose in surprise. He's talking again. Jesse nodded, a flicker of pride cutting through his concern. Started a few days ago. Hasn't stopped since. The sheriff's face softened as he regarded the boy. That's good news, son. Real good news. He turned back to Jesse, his expression growing serious once more. I can't tell you when they'll make a move, but I'd keep your eyes open, and maybe consider sending the boy somewhere safe for a while. This is his home, Jesse said firmly. We're not running. No one's asking you to run, Sawyer replied. Just to be prepared. Nadia, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke. What does Harrington really want? Is it just hatred of me? Or is there something more? Sawyer gave her an appraising look, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You're sharp, Mrs. Blackwood. Yes, there's more. There's always more." He turned to Jesse. "Harrington's been meeting with a man named Cornelius Wade. Eastern businessman, represents a railroad company. They're planning a new line through the territory and a station not far from here." "What does that have to do with us?" Jesse asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Railroad needs water," Sawyer said simply. "Lots of it for the steam engines and for the town they're planning to build around the station. Your land has the most reliable source for miles." Jesse's hands clenched into fists on the table. "So Harrington's stirring up hatred against Nadia as a pretext to drive us off the land, just like he tried with Eleanor." Sawyer's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying about your wife's death, Blackwood?" "I'm saying she was poisoned," Jesse stated flatly, "after refusing to sell this land to Harrington for his new church. A church that I'm guessing would have been conveniently located near this planned railroad station." The sheriff was silent for a long moment, digesting this information. "That's a serious accusation," he said finally. "Do you have proof?" "Eleanor's journal," Jesse replied. "She documented her symptoms, suspected the tea Mrs. Harrington brought after Noah's birth." "Why didn't you come to me with this?" "I did," Jesse reminded him, an edge creeping into his voice. "You said there wasn't enough evidence." Sawyer ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking older. "I remember, and I was wrong to dismiss you. But without the tea, without a way to prove what was in it." He shook his head. "The law requires evidence, Blackwood. Solid evidence that would stand up in court. And while you wait for evidence that will never appear, more innocent people die." Nadia said, her voice quiet, but cutting. "Like your wife. Like Eleanor. Like I nearly did." The sheriff had no response to that, his gaze dropping to his hat once more. Noah, sensing the tension in the room, pressed closer to Nadia. "Nadi, stay," he asked, his voice small but clear. "Nadi safe?" "Yes, little one," she assured him, smoothing his hair. "I'm staying right here with you and your papa." Sawyer watched this interaction, something like resolve hardening in his eyes. "I'll do what I can to keep an eye on Harrington and his men," he said, rising from the table. "But you should prepare for the worst. These men won't be stopped by badges or laws." "We'll be ready," Jesse promised, standing to see the sheriff out. At the door, Sawyer paused, turning back to Nadia. "Mrs. Blackwood, I know it's not my place to ask, but do you have family, others of your people nearby who might help?" Nadia shook her head. "My mother's band moved north years ago after the reservation boundaries were redrawn. I've been alone since she died." Sawyer nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Then you'll have to be your own army," he said. "All of you." He retrieved his revolver from the porch railing and mounted his horse. "I'll try to send word if I hear anything specific about their plans." As he rode away, Jesse stood on the porch watching until the sheriff was just a distant figure on the horizon. Nadia joined him, Noah at her side. "Do you trust him?" she asked quietly. Jesse considered the question. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But I believe he's carrying a heavy guilt about his wife. That might be enough to keep him honest, at least in this." Nadia nodded, her gaze following Sawyer's retreating form. "A man haunted by the past can be unpredictable. But he came to warn us when he could have said nothing." "Papa," Noah tugged at Jesse's hand. "Who's Eleanor?" The simple question caught Jesse off guard. It was the first time Noah had spoken his mother's name since her death, the first indication that he was processing the conversation they'd just had. Jesse knelt to his son's level, choosing his words carefully. Eleanor was your mother, Noah. You remember her, don't you? She had golden hair like yours, and she loved to read you stories at bedtime. Noah's brow furrowed in concentration. Mama sang, he said after a moment, like Noddy sings. Yes, Jesse confirmed, his throat tightening. She sang beautiful songs. She went away. Noah continued working through his memories. To the stars. Jesse glanced up at Nadia, who gave him an encouraging nod. That's right, son. She had to go away, but she loved you very much. She didn't want to leave us. Noah absorbed this, then reached out to touch his father's cheek. Bad man made Mama go away, like bad men want to make Nadi go away. The perceptiveness of the question stunned Jesse. He had underestimated how much Noah had understood of the conversation with Sawyer. How much the boy's silence had concealed a mind that was processing everything around him. We think so, Jesse answered honestly. But we're not going to let anyone take Nadi away, or you. We're going to stay together and protect each other. Noah nodded solemnly, accepting this promise with the complete trust of a child who believed his father could keep the world at bay. I help too, he declared. I be brave. You already are brave, Nadia assured him, kneeling beside Jesse. So brave and so strong. The boy beamed at her praise, then looked thoughtfully between the two adults. Are you my new mama now? He asked Nadia. The directness of the question caught her by surprise. She glanced at Jesse, uncertain how to respond. Nadia is, Jesse began, then faltered, unsure himself of how to define their unusual arrangement in terms a 5-year-old could understand. I am your friend, Noah, Nadia said gently, someone who cares for you very much. I can't replace your mama, no one can, but I'm here to help you and your papa for as long as you need me. Noah considered this, then nodded, apparently satisfied. Good, he declared. I like you here. With that, he turned and ran back into the house, the serious conversation already giving way to the more immediate concerns of childhood. Jesse and Nadia remained kneeling on the porch, suddenly aware of how close they were to each other. Jesse could see the flecks of gold in Nadia's dark eyes, could smell the faint scent of sage that seemed to cling to her skin. Thank you, he said, his voice low, for answering him honestly, for not making promises we don't know if we can keep. Nadia held his gaze, something unreadable in her expression. I don't believe in false promises, she said. Life has taught me that they only lead to greater pain. They rose together, a new awareness between them, not just of the external threat Sawyer had warned them about, but of the delicate balance they were maintaining in their unconventional household. We should prepare, Jesse said, stepping back slightly. If Sawyer's right, we don't have much time. Nadia nodded, her practical nature reasserting itself. Tell me what needs to be done and I'll help. And so, as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they set about fortifying their small sanctuary against the storm they could feel gathering on the horizon. The next week passed in a state of heightened vigilance. Jesse reinforced the doors and windows of the house, stockpiled ammunition, and kept his rifle within reach at all times. Nadia prepared her own defenses, gathering herbs and roots that could be used for healing or, if necessary, for less benevolent purposes. Together, they established routines and signals whistles that would alert each other to danger hiding places where Noah could conceal himself if strangers came paths through the property that offered the quickest escape routes. Through it all, they tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for Noah's sake. The boy's speech continued to improve, though he still had moments of silence when overwhelmed or tired. He seemed to understand in his childlike way that something was wrong, but he trusted the adults around him to keep him safe. It was on a clear, crisp morning, as Jesse worked in the barn on a new modification to his irrigation pump, that Nadia came to him with a troubled expression. "Someone's coming," she said without preamble. "Two riders from the east." Jesse set down his tools, immediately moving to the barn door to look out across the property. Sure enough, two figures on horseback were approaching along the main road, still some distance away, but clearly headed for the ranch. "Take Noah to the house," he instructed, reaching for his rifle. "Use the cellar if necessary." Nadia nodded, already turning to where Noah was playing with a small wooden horse Jesse had carved for him. "Come, little one," she said calmly. "Time for a story inside." The boy looked up, sensing the tension beneath her casual tone. "Bad men?" he asked, his voice small. "We don't know yet," Nadia answered honestly. "But your papa will keep us safe. Come now." As they hurried toward the house, Jesse positioned himself near the barn entrance, rifle ready, but not raised. He wouldn't fire the first shot, but he'd be damned if he'd hesitate if these visitors meant harm. The riders drew closer, and Jesse felt a flicker of surprise as he recognized one of them, Sheriff Sawyer. The other was a stranger, an older man in a black coat that marked him as someone of means, riding a fine bay horse that had clearly never worked a day in its life. Sawyer raised a hand in greeting as they approached, his expression unreadable behind his thick mustache. "Blackwood," he called. "This here is Mr. Thomas Claiborne. He's a friend." Jesse didn't lower his rifle. "Friend to whom?" The older man, Claiborne, dismounted with the stiffness of someone unaccustomed to long rides. "I was a friend to your wife, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice cultured with the hint of an Eastern accent. "I was her teacher many years ago." Jesse studied the man warily. "Eleanor never mentioned a Professor Claiborne." "She wouldn't have," the man agreed. "Not by that name, at least. She knew me as Father Thomas. I was a missionary among the Shoshone when she came west to study their use of medicinal plants." The name stirred a vague recollection. Eleanor had spoken of a priest who had encouraged her botanical studies, who had introduced her to indigenous healers despite the disapproval of his superiors. "You're a long way from the mission," Jesse observed, still not lowering his weapon. "I left the church some years ago," Claiborne explained. "Found my calling in education instead. I teach at a small college in Denver now." He glanced at Sawyer. "The sheriff found me there and told me of Eleanor's death, and of your current situation." Jesse's gaze shifted to Sawyer, who met it steadily. "Why bring him here?" he demanded. "Because he knows things," Sawyer replied. "Things about Wade and Harrington. Things that might help you protect your family." The word family hung in the air, acknowledging what the three of them, Jesse, Nadia, and Noah, had become, despite the unusual circumstances of their union. Jesse hesitated, then finally lowered his rifle. "Come inside," he said. "But I'll want to hear exactly how you two found each other before I decide whether to trust either of you." Claiborne nodded, accepting these terms without offense. As they approached the house, the door opened, and Nadia appeared, Noah partially hidden behind her skirts. "It's all right," Jesse called to her. "They say they're friends." Nadia's posture remained tense, her eyes wary as she assessed the newcomers. Noah peeked around her curiosity, overcoming his caution. "Mrs. Blackwood," Sawyer greeted her with a respectful nod. "This is Professor Claiborne. He knew Eleanor." "Did he?" Nadia said, not quite a question, her tone making it clear that this didn't automatically earn him her trust. Claiborne studied her with open interest, though not in a way that felt threatening. "You have the look of a healer," he observed. "The way you stand, the way you watch. Eleanor had it too, though differently expressed." Nadia's eyes narrowed slightly. You knew her well. I taught her, Claiborne replied, but in time she taught me more than I could ever teach her. She had a gift for understanding the language of plants of the earth itself. Something in his words seemed to resonate with Nadia, for her posture relaxed fractionally. She stepped aside, allowing them to enter the house, though she kept Noah close to her side. Inside, they gathered around the kitchen table, an unlikely assembly. The widower, the supposed witch, the conflicted lawman, and the former priest turned professor. Noah sat on a small stool near Nadia, quietly observing the adults with those perceptive eyes of his. Start talking, Jesse said to Sawyer. How did you find Claiborne? The sheriff removed his hat, placing it on the table. After our conversation last week, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said about Eleanor being poisoned, about Harrington's connection to Wade and the railroad. It was too similar to what happened with Maria. He glanced at Nadia. And with you. He paused, collecting his thoughts. I started looking through old papers records from when Harrington first came to Willow Creek 12 years ago. Found out he wasn't always a bishop, used to be just a regular preacher at a small church in Colorado. Moved here after some kind of scandal that never quite made it into the official record. What kind of scandal? Jesse asked, his interest piqued. That's where the trail went cold, Sawyer admitted. But I remembered Eleanor had studied in Colorado before coming here. Thought maybe there was a connection. So you tracked me down, Claiborne interjected. Quite persistently, I might add. Sawyer shrugged. Wasn't hard. Eleanor kept journals. Jesse showed me some of them after she died. Your name, your real name, was mentioned several times. Jesse's brow furrowed. I don't remember seeing his name in her journals. Not in the ones she kept here, Sawyer agreed. In the ones she stored in the bank vault in town. Said they were research notes too valuable to risk in a house fire. This was news to Jesse. She never told me about those. She was protecting you, Claiborne said quietly. And Noah. What she discovered was dangerous to certain interests. What did she discover? Nadia asked, leaning forward, her interest evident despite her caution. Claiborne looked to Sawyer, who nodded encouragingly. The water, the professor said simply. The water on your land, Mr. Blackwood. It's special, different. Eleanor had been studying it for years. Jesse nodded slowly. She called it living water, said it made plants grow stronger, helped them resist disease. That's why she was so passionate about the irrigation project, to spread its benefits beyond our land. It's more than that, Claiborne said, his voice dropping lower. The minerals in that water have properties beyond agricultural applications. Eleanor isolated compounds that showed remarkable healing effects in her laboratory tests. Compounds that could potentially treat diseases that modern medicine has failed to address. Nadia's eyes widened slightly. That's why the bishop's wife brought her poison tea, she said, the pieces falling into place. Not just because of the land for the railroad, but because of what she knew about the water. Claiborne nodded. Eleanor wrote to me about her findings. She was excited, but also cautious. She knew that if certain people discovered what she had found, they would stop at nothing to control it. People like Cornelius Wade, Jesse guessed. Exactly, Sawyer confirmed. Wade isn't just a railroad man. He has investments in pharmaceutical companies back east, the kind that would pay a fortune for exclusive rights to a miracle cure. And Harrington, Jesse pressed, where does he fit in? Claiborne and Sawyer exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. It was Claiborne who finally answered. Francis Harrington and I were at the seminary together many years ago. He was ambitious even then, saw the church as a path to influence rather than a calling to serve. The professor's face darkened with old memories. When I was working with the Shoshone, he was assigned to a nearby mission. There were incidents. Native children who died under suspicious circumstances, allegations of inappropriate behavior. He was forced to leave, Sawyer continued. The church covered it up as they often do, sent him here to a remote parish where his past wouldn't follow him. But you knew, Nadia said to Claiborne. You knew what he was. The professor nodded, regret evident in his lined face. I tried to warn people, but who would listen to one priest against the word of the church hierarchy? I left the order not long after, unable to reconcile my vows with the corruption I had witnessed. Noah, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. Bad man hurt children, he asked, his young voice piercing in its clarity. The adults fell silent, reminded of the innocent ears among them. Jesse moved to kneel beside his son. Some people do bad things, Noah, he said gently. That's why we have to be careful, and why we have to protect each other. The boy nodded solemnly, then looked at Claiborne. You help us fight bad men. The professor seemed taken aback by the direct question, but answered with equal directness. Yes, young man, that's why I'm here. Good, Noah declared, as if that settled the matter. He returned to petting the small wooden horse in his hands, apparently satisfied with the professor's commitment. Jesse rose, turning back to Sawyer and Claiborne. So Wade wants the water for profit, and Harrington is his willing accomplice. That explains the attempts to drive us off the land. But why the obsession with Nadia? Why frame her for the Reverend's death? Because she represents what they fear most, Claiborne said, glancing at Nadia with something like respect. Indigenous knowledge. The very knowledge that led Eleanor to her discoveries in the first place. If the town accepted a healer like Mrs. Blackwood, they might begin to question the bishop's authority, might begin to see alternatives to the narratives he's constructed. And, Sawyer added grimly, because they needed a distraction. The Reverend was beginning to ask questions about Harrington's relationship with Wade, about money that had gone missing from the church building fund. My guess is they silenced him, then needed someone to blame. Nadia's face remained impassive, but Jesse could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands curled into fists in her lap. So I was convenient, she said flatly. An outsider, different, easy to blame. Yes, Claiborne admitted. I'm sorry. Don't apologize for them, she replied, a flash of anger breaking through her calm facade. You didn't hang the rope around my neck. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. It was Noah who broke it, climbing into Nadia's lap and wrapping his small arms around her neck. Nadi, stay, he said firmly. Papa and Noah keep Nadi safe. The simple declaration seemed to drain the tension from Nadia's body. She held the boy close, her eyes closing briefly as she drew strength from his innocent affection. Yes, little one, she murmured. We keep each other safe. Jesse watched them, a complex emotion tightening his chest. Then he turned back to Sawyer and Claiborne. You've told us about the danger, he said. Now tell us how to fight it. Claiborne reached into his coat, withdrawing a leather portfolio. Eleanor's research notes, he explained, placing them on the table. Copies of what she sent me over the years. They provide scientific proof of the water's properties, proof that would stand up to scrutiny in a court of law. And evidence of Harrington's past, Sawyer added, producing a folded newspaper from inside his vest. I telegraphed some contacts in Colorado. They sent this article about the unfortunate incidents at his former mission. It doesn't name him directly, but the dates and locations match. Jesse took the papers, leafing through them quickly. This is a start, he acknowledged. But Wade and Harrington won't be stopped by the threat of exposure alone. They've already killed once, twice, if we count the Reverend. They won't hesitate to do it again. They're planning something soon. Sawyer said, his expression grim. Wade's brought in men from outside the territory, hard cases, the kind who do ugly work for money. They're staying at the old hunting cabin near Broken Ridge. How many? Jesse asked, already calculating odds, planning defenses. At least 6 plus Harrington's usual followers from town, maybe a dozen men total. Nadia's voice cut through the grim assessment. We can't fight that many, not directly. All eyes turned to her. She sat straight-backed, Noah still in her lap, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful. My people didn't survive by meeting stronger enemies head-on, she continued. We survived by understanding the land better than they did by using their weaknesses against them. Claiborne nodded slowly. Mrs. Blackwood is right. Direct confrontation would be suicide. But there may be another way. He looked at Jesse. The irrigation system you've been building, how far along is it? Jesse's brow furrowed. The main channel from the creek is complete. The distribution system to the fields is about half finished. Why? A slow smile spread across Claiborne's weathered face. Because, Mr. Blackwood, I believe Eleanor's final gift to you might be the very thing that saves your lives. As evening fell, Sawyer and Claiborne prepared to leave. They had spent the afternoon poring over maps of the property, examining Jesse's irrigation plans, and formulating a strategy that might give them a fighting chance against the forces gathering against them. I'll return tomorrow with supplies, Claiborne promised as he mounted his horse. Tools, materials, and a few items from my personal laboratory that may prove useful. Jesse nodded, extending his hand to the professor. Thank you, he said simply, for believing Eleanor, for coming here. Claiborne clasped his hand firmly. I owed it to her, he replied, and to the truth she sought to protect. Sawyer adjusted his hat, his expression troubled in the fading light. I'll keep my ears open in town, try to learn when they're planning to move. But I can't be too obvious about it. If Harrington suspects I'm working against him, we lose what little advantage we have. Be careful, Nadia cautioned, standing at Jesse's side. The bishop has eyes everywhere, and a man with secrets fears exposure above all else. The sheriff's mouth quirked in a humorless smile. I've kept my own secrets for 15 years, Mrs. Blackwood. I know how to play this game. He tipped his hat to her, then to Jesse. Take care of each other. I'll be back when I can. They watched the two men ride away, their silhouettes growing smaller against the sunset-painted sky. Noah, standing between Jesse and Nadia, slipped his small hands into theirs. Will the bad men come tonight, Papa? He asked, his voice steady, despite the fear behind the question. Jesse squeezed his son's hand reassuringly. Not tonight, I think, but soon. He knelt to look Noah in the eye. Remember what we practiced. If you hear the owl call, you go to the special hiding place and stay there until one of us comes for you. Noah nodded solemnly. The place under the barn floor, with the blankets and the water jug and Mr. Bear. That's right, Jesse confirmed. You're very brave, Noah, but your job isn't to fight, it's to stay safe. Can you promise me that? Promise, the boy agreed. Then, with the directness of childhood, is Nadia scared? Jesse glanced up at Nadia, who had been listening to their exchange with a carefully neutral expression. Why don't you ask her? He suggested gently. Noah turned his solemn gaze to Nadia. Are you scared, Nadia? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, then knelt beside Jesse so that she was at Noah's eye level. Yes, little one, I am scared, she admitted. Only fools feel no fear when danger comes. But being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what must be done even when you are afraid. Noah absorbed this wisdom, then reached out to touch her cheek with a small hand. "I'll be brave too," he promised, "for you and Papa." Nadia caught his hand, pressing a kiss to his palm. "I know you will," she said softly. "You have a strong spirit, Noah Blackwood, like your father, like your mother before you." The mention of Eleanor brought a fleeting sadness to Noah's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by resolve, a child's determination to live up to the legacy of a mother he barely remembered, and the expectations of the adults he loved. "Supper time," Jesse said, straightening up and ruffling Noah's hair. "Let's go inside before it gets cold." As they turned toward the house, the last light of day gilding their figures, they appeared for all the world like a family not bound by blood or conventional vows, but by something perhaps more enduring: shared purpose, mutual respect, and the tentative beginnings of love. Inside, they moved through their evening routine, setting the table, serving the simple meal Nadia had prepared earlier, talking about safe topics that wouldn't frighten Noah. But beneath the domestic calm, both adults were acutely aware of the storm gathering on the horizon. After Noah was tucked into bed, Jesse and Nadia sat at the kitchen table, the plans they had made with Sawyer and Claiborne spread out before them. "Do you think it will work?" Nadia asked quietly, tracing the path of the irrigation channels on the map. Jesse ran a hand through his hair, fatigue evident in the set of his shoulders. "It has to," he said simply. "We don't have many other options." Nadia studied his face in the lamplight, noting the lines of worry etched around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw. "You don't have to fight for me," she said after a moment. "I could go draw them away from you and Noah. You could say I ran off, that the marriage was a mistake." Jesse's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers with surprising intensity. "Is that what you want, to leave?" "No," she admitted, the word barely audible. "But I would to keep you both safe." "And then what?" Jesse demanded, an edge creeping into his voice. "Harrington and Wade still want this land. They'd find another reason to come after us, another witch to blame for their greed." He shook his head firmly. "No, we stand together, or not at all." The vehemence of his response surprised her. "You barely know me," she pointed out. "Why risk everything, your life, Noah's future, for someone who was a stranger to you 2 weeks ago?" Jesse was silent for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the map between them. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost hesitant. "You're not a stranger anymore, Nadia. You brought my son back to me when I thought he was lost forever. You've helped me see beyond my grief, beyond the walls I built around us after Eleanor died." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "And I think Eleanor would have liked you, would have wanted you here protecting what she loved." The sincerity in his words touched something deep within Nadia, a place she had thought long closed off, after years of rejection and suspicion. She reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching the back of his hand. "Then we stand together," she said, her voice steady. "All of us." Jesse turned his hand, his fingers curling around hers. It was the first time they had touched like this, deliberately, with intent, beyond the practical necessities of their arrangement. The contact sent a current of warmth up Nadia's arm, surprising in its intensity. They remained that way for a moment, connected by that simple touch, by the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. Then slowly, reluctantly, Jesse withdrew his hand, returning his attention to the plans before them. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice a shade rougher than before. Tomorrow we start preparing in earnest. Nadia nodded, rising from the table. I'll check on Noah before I sleep. At the doorway to the hallway, she paused, looking back at Jesse, who remained seated at the table, his face half in shadow. Jesse, she said softly. He looked up, waiting. Thank you, she said simply, for believing in me when no one else would. Before he could respond, she had slipped away down the hallway, leaving him alone with the maps, the plans, and the echo of her words in the quiet house. Jesse sat for a long time after she had gone, his mind turning over the events of the day, the revelations about Eleanor's research, the danger approaching from town, and perhaps most unsettling of all, the growing awareness that his feelings for Nadia had evolved beyond gratitude or practical alliance. It wasn't betrayal, he told himself. Eleanor was gone, and she would have wanted him to find happiness again, to provide Noah with a mother's love. But it felt strange nonetheless, this stirring of emotions he had thought buried with his wife. Eventually he rose, dousing the lamp, and making his way to his own room. As he passed Noah's door, he paused, easing it open to check on his son. To his surprise, the bed was empty. A moment of panic gripped him before he noticed the soft glow of lamplight beneath Nadia's door across the hall. Quietly, he approached, listening. Nadia's voice came from within, soft and melodious, singing a lullaby in her native tongue. Jesse eased the door open just enough to see inside. Noah lay curled against Nadia's side on the narrow bed, his teddy bear clutched to his chest, his eyes heavy with approaching sleep. Nadia sat beside him, one hand stroking his hair as she sang, her face peaceful in the gentle lamplight. It was a scene of such tender domesticity that Jesse felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was what he had hoped for when he had impulsively claimed Nadia at the gallows, that Noah might find comfort and security in her presence. What he hadn't anticipated was how her presence would affect him, how she would begin to fill the empty spaces in their lives with her quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. As if sensing his presence, Nadia looked up, her song faltering for a moment. Their eyes met across the small room, a world of unspoken feelings passing between them. "Nightmare," she whispered, explaining Noah's presence in her bed. "He didn't want to wake you." Jesse nodded, understanding. "He can stay," he said softly, "if that's all right with you." "Of course," Nadia replied, resuming her gentle stroking of Noah's hair. "Sleep well, Jesse." "And you?" He returned reluctantly, closing the door on the peaceful scene. In his own room, Jesse lay awake for a long time, listening to the night sounds of the house, the creak of timbers settling, the whisper of wind against the window panes, the distant hooting of an owl in the trees beyond the barn. Tomorrow, they would begin preparing for battle, transforming Eleanor's dream of nurturing water into a defense against those who would take everything from them. It was a bitter irony that her life's work would be used this way, but perhaps also fitting a final act of protection from beyond the grave. As sleep finally claimed him, Jesse's last conscious thought was a silent promise to Eleanor, to Noah, to Nadia, and to himself that he would not fail them. That whatever came in the days ahead, he would fight with everything he had to protect what they had built together, this unlikely family forged in grief and danger and tentative hope. Outside, a soft rain began to fall, nourishing the earth and feeding the creek that wound through their land, the living water that had brought them together and might yet save them all. Flower in the Storm. Part 3. The storm breaks. Dawn arrived with the promise of summer heat, the early morning light casting long shadows across the Blackwood Ranch. Jesse had been awake for hours, making final adjustments to the irrigation channels that now crisscrossed his property in a complex network. What had begun as Eleanor's dream A system to bring life-giving water to parched soil had been transformed into something more strategic. With Professor Claiborne's guidance and Nadia's knowledge of the land, they had created a defensive grid that could, if necessary, turn the very earth against their enemies. Jesse straightened, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed his work. The main channel from the creek had been widened at key points, creating holding pools that could be released on command. Secondary channels had been dug to specific areas, choke points where riders would be forced to pass if they approached the house. Hidden sluice gates operated by ropes concealed in the tall grass would allow them to flood these areas within moments, turning solid ground into treacherous mud. It wasn't a perfect defense, but it might give them the advantage they needed. "Papa!" Noah's voice called from the direction of the house. Jesse turned to see his son running toward him, Nadia following at a more measured pace, a basket over her arm. "Careful near the channels," Jesse cautioned, but smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. Noah had been increasingly talkative in the days since his first words, as if making up for lost time. Each new sentence, each question or observation felt like a gift. "We brought breakfast," Noah announced proudly, pointing to the basket Nadia carried. "Nadia made biscuits." "Did she now?" Jesse raised an eyebrow at Nadia, who approached with a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Someone had to feed you," she said simply. "You left before first light." They settled on a grassy knoll overlooking the newly completed irrigation system, spreading a cloth on the ground for their impromptu picnic. Nadia produced biscuits still warm from the oven, along with a jar of honey and strips of dried venison. Noah chattered happily as they ate, seemingly oblivious to the tension that had gripped the adults for days. But Jesse noticed how the boy's eyes constantly scanned the horizon, how he startled at unexpected sounds, signs that even at 5 years old, Noah understood more about their situation than they had given him credit for. "Will the professor come today?" Nadia asked, passing Jesse a cup of coffee from a small thermos. He nodded, accepting the cup with murmured thanks. "Said he'd be here by midday, bringing the last of the supplies we need." Nadia's expression remained calm, but Jesse had learned to read the subtle signs of her concern, the slight tightening around her eyes, the way her fingers plucked at the hem of her dress. "And Sawyer, any word?" "Nothing since yesterday." Jesse kept his voice low, mindful of Noah's presence. "He said he'd try to learn when they're planning to move, but it's dangerous for him," Nadia finished. "I know." They fell silent, watching Noah as he carefully arranged pebbles in a pattern on the ground beside them. The boy had developed a fascination with creating ordered designs, circles within circles, spirals, lines radiating outward from a central point. Nadia had told Jesse it reminded her of the sacred patterns her people used in healing ceremonies. "Do you think it will be enough?" Nadia asked after a while, her gaze moving over the irrigation channels that now scarred the landscape. "All of this?" Jesse considered the question seriously. "Honestly, I don't know. But it's more than we had before." He looked at her directly. "Are you having second thoughts?" "About staying?" Nadia shook her head, her dark braid swinging gently with the movement. "No, this is where I'm meant to be." Her eyes shifted to Noah, a softness entering her expression. "With both of you." The simple declaration warmed something in Jesse's chest. Before he could respond, Noah abandoned his pebble arrangement and scrambled onto Nadia's lap. "Nadi," the boy said, his expression suddenly serious. "Will you teach me the song? The one about the brave warrior?" Nadia smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "You want to learn an Apache song?" Noah nodded emphatically. "For when the bad men come, to be brave." Jesse and Nadia exchanged a glance over the boy's head, concern mingled with pride at his determination to face the coming danger in his own way. Very well, Nadia agreed. But it must be sung with respect. These are sacred words, passed down through many generations. As she began to sing, teaching Noah the unfamiliar syllables, phrase by phrase, Jesse watched them together, this woman who had walked out of the shadow of death and into their lives, and his son, who had emerged from the prison of silence with her help. Whatever happened in the days to come, he realized they were already a family. Not in the conventional sense, perhaps, but bound by something just as powerful as blood, or legal vows, shared struggle, mutual protection, and the fragile growing affection that had blossomed between them. It was worth fighting for, worth dying for, if necessary. The thought had barely formed when Jesse noticed a cloud of dust on the horizon, a rider approaching fast along the main road. He was on his feet instantly, hand going to the revolver at his hip. "Nadia," he said, his voice tight, "take Noah to the house." She followed his gaze to the distant rider, then gathered Noah into her arms without question. "Come, little one, time for your lessons." "But the song," Noah protested. "We'll finish it later," Nadia promised, already moving toward the house with swift, sure steps. "Right now you must do as your father says." Jesse waited until they were safely inside before moving to intercept the approaching rider. As the figure drew closer, he recognized the distinctive silhouette of Sheriff Sawyer riding hard, his horse lathered with exertion. Something was wrong. The sheriff would never push his mount that hard unless the news was urgent. Sawyer reined in his horse in a spray of dust, his normally composed face tight with tension. "They're coming," he said without preamble, his voice rough from the hard ride. "Tonight, full moon. They plan to surround the property just after midnight." Jesse's blood ran cold. "How many?" 15, maybe more. Wade's brought in extra men from the railroad crew." Sawyer dismounted, leading his winded horse toward the water trough. "They're armed to the teeth, Blackwood. Rifles, shotguns, even a couple of Gatling guns mounted on wagons." "Jesus," Jesse muttered. "That's not a posse, that's a war party." Sawyer nodded grimly. "Wade's not taking any chances. He wants this land, and he wants it clean. No witnesses, no claimants." He lowered his voice. "They're talking about burning you out, setting fire to the house with all of you inside." The brutality of the plan shouldn't have surprised Jesse, but it did. Even knowing what these men were capable of, the poisoning of Eleanor, the framing of Nadia, the cold-blooded intent to murder a child, struck him like a physical blow. "We need to get Noah out," he said, thinking aloud. "Somewhere safe until this is over." "There's nowhere safe within a day's ride," Sawyer countered. "Not from Wade. He has men in every settlement from here to the territorial line." The sheriff hesitated, then added reluctantly, "There is one option, though you won't like it." "What?" "The old Apache camp in the high country, 3 hours hard ride east in the shadow of Raven's Peak." Sawyer's expression was carefully neutral. "Nadia would know the way. It's been abandoned for years, but the shelters might still stand. No white man would think to look for the boy there." Jesse considered the suggestion. The idea of sending Noah away, of not being there to protect him if things went wrong, was almost unbearable. But keeping him at the ranch with an armed force descending on them was even more dangerous. "I'll discuss it with Nadia," he said finally. "Is Claiborne still coming?" Sawyer nodded. "He was preparing to leave when I rode out. Should be here within the hour." The sheriff's gaze moved over the irrigation channels. "How's it coming? Will it work?" "It'll work," Jesse affirmed, though with less certainty than he tried to project. "If we can draw them into the right positions, if the water pressure holds, If they don't simply burn us out from a distance? Too many ifs, Sawyer observed grimly. Got a better plan. The sheriff sighed, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. No,
But I've brought something that might help. He reached into his saddlebag, withdrawing a cloth-wrapped bundle. Dynamite, 6 sticks. Claiborne suggested it might be useful for your channels. Jesse took the bundle carefully. The professor had mentioned the possibility of creating strategic breaks in the landscape points, where the release of water could be more dramatic, more disorienting. The dynamite would make that possible. Thank you, he said simply. You're risking a lot, Sawyer. The sheriff's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. 15 years too late, but I'm finally choosing the right side. He glanced toward the house. You should tell them. Make your preparations. I'll keep watch on the road for Claiborne. Jesse nodded, tucking the dynamite securely into his own bag. As he walked back to the house, his mind raced with calculations and contingencies. The full moon meant visibility would be good, a mixed blessing. They would see their attackers coming, but would also be more exposed themselves. Nadia met him at the door, her expression questioning. Sheriff Sawyer, she asked, what news? Tonight, Jesse said simply. Just after midnight. She absorbed this with remarkable composure, though he saw her hand tighten on the door frame. How many? Too many for a fair fight. He glanced past her to where Noah sat at the table practicing his letters on a slate. We need to talk, privately. Nadia nodded, turning to the boy. Noah, continue with your writing. I'll check your work when I return. Yes, Nadi, Noah replied, his tongue poking out slightly as he concentrated on forming the letters correctly. They stepped onto the porch, moving to the far end, where their voices wouldn't carry to the boy inside. Jesse explained Sawyer's information quickly, including the suggestion about the Apache camp. I know the place, Nadia confirmed, her expression thoughtful. It was a summer hunting camp for my mother's people, used for generations before the reservation boundaries were drawn. The shelters might still stand, as the sheriff said. Would Noah be safe there, truly? Nadia considered the question carefully. Safer than here, I believe. The camp is well hidden, and there is water nearby. With provisions, he could wait there until... She hesitated. Until it's over. The unspoken possibility that it might be over because they were dead hung between them. You would need to take him, Jesse said quietly. I can't leave, not with Claiborne coming, not with all the preparations still to be made. And Noah trusts you. Nadia's eyes widened slightly. You would entrust your son to me, alone. Yes, Jesse said simply. I would. The depth of that trust seemed to touch her deeply. She looked away toward the distant mountains where the camp lay hidden. When should we leave? As soon as Claiborne arrives. You'll need to reach the camp before dark. Jesse hesitated, then added, If things go badly here, you should continue east with Noah. There are settlements beyond the territorial line where Wade's influence doesn't reach. You could start again. Nadia turned back to him, her dark eyes searching his face. And if things don't go badly, if you succeed, then I'll come for you both, Jesse promised, as soon as it's safe. She studied him for a long moment, as if memorizing his features. Then, with a decisiveness that surprised him, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a brief, fierce kiss that conveyed more than words could have. You will come for us, she said as she drew back her voice, allowing no contradiction. Because we will be waiting. All three of us have lost too much already. The spirits will not be so cruel as to take more. Before Jesse could respond to this unexpected display of emotion, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Professor Claiborne had arrived, his wagon loaded with supplies, his aged face set in lines of determination. "Ah, I see. The sheriff reached you," he called as he pulled the wagon to a stop before the house. "No time to waste, then. We have work to do." The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. Claiborne had brought not only the promised laboratory equipment, but also additional weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies. They worked together to position these resources strategically around the property, with Sawyer offering tactical advice based on his years as a lawman. Nadia prepared for the journey to the Apache camp, packing provisions, water, and extra clothing for Noah. The boy, sensing the urgency in the adults around him, remained unusually quiet, watching with solemn eyes as his small world transformed into a military encampment. "Papa," he asked as Jesse knelt to help him into the warm jacket Nadia had laid out, "are you coming with us to the mountain?" Jesse shook his head, choosing honesty over false comfort. "No, son. I need to stay here to protect our home. Nadi will take good care of you until I come for you." Noah's lower lip trembled slightly, but he nodded with a bravery that squeezed Jesse's heart. "I'll be good for Nadi," he promised. "And I'll sing the brave warrior song." "That's my boy." Jesse pulled him into a tight embrace, breathing in the clean, innocent scent of his hair. "I'm so proud of you, Noah, so very proud." When he finally released his son, Jesse found Nadia watching them, her own eyes suspiciously bright. She had changed into more practical clothing for the journey, a split riding skirt, a warm shirt, and sturdy boots that Eleanor had once worn for her botanical expeditions. "The horses are ready," she said softly. "We should leave soon to reach the camp before dark." Jesse nodded, rising to his feet. "I'll see you off." Outside, Sawyer and Claiborne had finished loading the last of the supplies into the irrigation control points, glass containers of chemicals that, when combined with the mineral-rich water from the creek, would create disorienting smoke and stinging spray. "Quite ingenious, really," Claiborne was explaining to Sawyer. Eleanor discovered that the water's unique mineral composition, when agitated or heated, releases compounds that affect the mucous membranes, eyes, nose, throat. Not lethal, but extremely uncomfortable. "Like tear gas," Sawyer observed. "Similar, yes, though these effects are more targeted." The professor noticed Jesse approaching with Nadia and Noah. "Ah, they're ready to depart. Good. Timing will be crucial tonight." Jesse helped Nadia mount her horse, then lifted Noah up to sit before her. The boy clung to the saddle horn, his face a mixture of fear and determination. "Remember the owl call?" Jesse reminded him, touching his small boot. "3 hoots, then 2, then 3 again. That's how you'll know it's safe to come out if you need to hide." Noah nodded solemnly. 3, 2, 3, I remember, Papa." Jesse turned to Nadia, words failing him as he looked up at her. How could he express what he needed to say? That in the short time she had been with them, she had become essential. That the thought of her not returning was unbearable. She seemed to understand without him speaking. Leaning down from the saddle, she touched his cheek gently. "We will see you soon," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "When the danger has passed." "Yes," Jesse agreed, covering her hand with his own for a brief moment. "Soon." With a final nod to Sawyer and Claiborne, Nadia straightened in the saddle and nudged her horse forward. A second mount loaded with supplies followed on a lead rope. Jesse watched them go, Noah's small figure growing more distant with each passing moment until they disappeared into the tree line at the eastern edge of the property. "She'll keep him safe," Sawyer said quietly, coming to stand beside Jesse. "She's stronger than she looks." "I know," Jesse replied, his eyes still fixed on the point where they had vanished. "It's not her strength, I doubt. It's our chances here."
Claiborne joined them, his expression sympathetic but practical. "Then let us improve those chances, Mr. Blackwood. We have much to do before nightfall." With a final glance toward the east, Jesse turned back to the task at hand. Nadia and Noah were beyond his protection now. The best he could do for them was to ensure there was a home for them to return to, and that meant surviving the night. "Let's get to work," he said simply. The sun had begun its descent toward the western mountains when Sheriff Sawyer, who had been keeping watch from the barn roof, spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon. "Riders coming," he called down to Jesse and Claiborne, who were making final adjustments to the irrigation controls. "At least a dozen moving fast." Jesse's head snapped up, a cold dread settling in his stomach. "From town?" "No," Sawyer replied, shading his eyes against the setting sun. "From the north, not the main road." Claiborne frowned, consulting the pocket watch he had produced from his vest. "It's too early. Wade's men weren't supposed to move until midnight." "Unless they change their plans," Jesse said grimly, reaching for his rifle. "Or unless these are different men entirely." They gathered at the front of the house, watching as the riders drew closer. Through Claiborne's field glasses, Jesse could make out details. Now rough-looking men, heavily armed, led by a figure in a black coat on a distinctive white horse. "That's not Wade," Sawyer muttered, peering through the glasses himself. "Don't recognize him." "I do," Claiborne said, his voice suddenly tense. "That's Matthias Kane, Wade's enforcer from the railroad, a very dangerous man." Why would he come early? Jesse wondered aloud. Why not wait for the main force as planned? Sawyer's expression darkened with realization. "Because they know I warned you. Someone in town must have talked or seen me ride out." He checked his revolver, a grim certainty in his movements. "They're coming to deal with me first, clear the way for the midnight attack." "Or they've simply decided to strike before we're fully prepared," Claiborne suggested. "Either way, we must assume the original plan has changed." Jesse's thoughts flew to Nadia and Noah, who had left expecting hours of safe travel before any danger materialized. If Kane's men had seen them on the road, "We need to draw them here," he decided. "Keep their attention on us." Sawyer nodded in understanding. "Give the woman and boy time to reach safety." "Exactly." Jesse turned to Claiborne. "Professor, are the primary channels ready?" "Ready enough," Claiborne confirmed. "Not as refined as I'd hoped, but they'll serve the purpose." "Good." Jesse checked his own weapons, the rifle, his revolver, and the hunting knife at his belt. "Sheriff, take position in the barn loft. You'll have the best view of the approaches from there. Professor, the house is yours. Trigger the south channel when they're in position." The men moved to their assigned stations, a tense efficiency in their actions. Jesse remained on the porch, deliberately visible, a solitary figure awaiting the approaching force. Kane and his men reined in about 100 yards from the house, just beyond effective rifle range. The enforcer raised a hand, signaling his men to hold position, then urged his white horse forward alone. "That's close enough," Jesse called when Kane was about 50 yards out. "State your business." Kane brought his horse to a stop, a cold smile playing across his bearded face. "Jesse Blackwood," he called back. "My employer, Mr. Wade, sends his regards, and an offer." "I'm listening," Jesse replied, though he had no intention of accepting any offer from Cornelius Wade. "Your land for your lives," Kane said simply. "Deed signed and witnessed today in exchange for safe passage for you, your son, and the Indian woman to the territorial border." Jesse's hands tightened on his rifle. "And if I refuse?" Kane's smile widened, revealing a bought tooth that caught the late afternoon sun. Then we burn everything to the ground and leave no witnesses. Mr. Wade is a businessman, Blackwood. He prefers clean transactions, but he'll accept messier solutions when necessary. Tell your employer, Jesse replied evenly, that this land is not for sale, not at any price. Kane sighed as if disappointed, but not surprised. He thought you might say that. Sentiment over sense, a common failing. He turned his horse, preparing to rejoin his men. We'll be back at midnight, Blackwood, with more men and less patience. Consider your options carefully until then. One more thing, Jesse called after him. The woman and boy you're looking for. They're already gone. Rode out at first light, headed for the territorial border. You'll never catch them now. It was a calculated risk. Letting Kane believe Nadia and Noah had a significant head start might divert resources from searching for them, but it also confirmed they had left the ranch. Jesse watched Kane's reaction carefully, looking for any sign that would reveal whether the enforcer already knew about their departure. Kane's expression flickered with what might have been surprise quickly masked. "Interesting," he said after a moment. "Sending them away while you stay to fight. Brave, but ultimately futile." He touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute. "Enjoy your final sunset, Blackwood. It promises to be a beautiful one." With that, he rejoined his men, and the group wheeled their horses around, riding back the way they had come. Jesse remained on the porch until they were out of sight, then signaled to Sawyer, who descended from the barn loft to join him. Claiborne emerged from the house a moment later. "They'll be back," Sawyer said unnecessarily, "and in greater numbers." "Yes," Jesse agreed, his mind racing. "But now we know they're coming, and they believe they've surprised us. We can use that."
"But what did you make of his reaction when you mentioned the woman and boy?" Claiborne asked shrewdly.
"I think it was news to him," Jesse replied, "which means they haven't spotted Nadia and Noah on the road. Yet," Sawyer added grimly, "we should assume they'll send scouts to verify your claim." Jesse nodded, his jaw set. "Then we need to keep them busy, make them focus all their attention here, not on the eastern trails." He turned to Claiborne. "Professor, can your chemicals create a more visible effect? Smoke, fire, anything that would be seen from a distance?" Claiborne considered this, tugging thoughtfully at his beard. "Perhaps, with the right catalysts added to the primary channel." He nodded decisively. "Yes, I believe I can arrange something quite spectacular. It will require some adjustments, however." "Make them," Jesse instructed. "Sheriff, help me move the extra ammunition to the root cellar. If they do set fire to the house, I don't want it all going up at once." As they worked through the remaining daylight hours, adjusting their plans to account for the earlier attack, Jesse found his thoughts continually returning to Nadia and Noah. Had they reached the Apache camp yet? Were they safe? Would the brave, solemn boy he had embraced just hours ago understand if his father never came for him as promised? The questions had no answers, and dwelling on them would only distract him from the task at hand. Jesse forced himself to focus on the preparations on the angles of fire from each window on the pressure gauges Claiborne had installed to monitor the water flow in the irrigation channels. By the time the sun disappeared behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land, they were as ready as they could be. "Now we wait," Sawyer said, checking his pocket watch. 4 hours until midnight." "They'll come earlier," Jesse predicted, gazing out at the darkening landscape. "Kane struck me as a man who prefers to change the rules when it suits him." "I concur," Claiborne added, joining them at the window. "Such men value unpredictability. It keeps their opponents off balance." As if confirming their assessment, a flicker of movement caught Jesse's eye at the edge of the property, just a shadow against shadows, but enough to alert him. "They're already here," he said quietly, moving into position along the tree line. Sawyer squinted into the gathering darkness. "I don't see anything." "Trust me," Jesse replied. "I've spent too many nights watching for predators around the livestock. They're there. Then we should assume they'll attack as soon as full darkness falls," Claiborne said pragmatically. "Another half hour at most." Jesse nodded, making a final mental check of their defenses. "Sheriff, take the upstairs window. You'll have the best angle on the north approach. Professor, the kitchen gives you access to the rear channels. I'll cover the front from here." As the men moved to their positions, a strange calm settled over Jesse. After months of grief of struggling alone with a silent child and the ghost of his murdered wife, after weeks of uncertainty following Nadia's arrival, the path before him was suddenly clear. He would fight not just for land or vengeance, but for the chance at a future he had glimpsed in the growing bond between Noah and Nadia, in the tentative warmth that had begun to thaw his frozen heart. It was worth any risk, any sacrifice. The attack when it came was swift and multi-pronged. Muzzle flashes erupted from the tree-line bullets thudding into the walls of the house and shattering windows. Men charged from multiple directions, using the cover of darkness and the distraction of gunfire to close the distance to the buildings. Jesse held his fire until the first wave of attackers reached the critical point, the seemingly solid ground before the front porch that concealed the primary irrigation channel. Then, with deliberate calm, he pulled the lever Claiborne had installed beside the window. There was a moment of stillness, of held breath, as the water began to flow through the hidden channels. Then, the ground before the house seemed to dissolve, transforming from solid earth to sucking mud in seconds. Men cried out in alarm as they found themselves suddenly knee-deep in mire. Their forward momentum halted. From the kitchen, Claiborne triggered his own mechanism. A series of small explosions erupted along the southern approach, not powerful enough to kill but sufficient to disorient and terrify. Clouds of chemical-laced steam billowed upward, carrying the mineral compounds from the creek water compounds that, as the professor had promised, produced intense irritation to the eyes and respiratory passages of anyone caught in their path. Attackers stumbled backward, coughing and cursing, clawing at their streaming eyes. From the upstairs window, Sawyer picked off those who still pressed forward, his marksmanship honed by years of practice. For a brief, exhilarating moment, it seemed their defenses might hold. The first wave had been repelled, confusion spreading through the attacking force as their careful plan dissolved into chaos. Then a new sound cut through the night, the mechanical clattering of a Gatling gun being brought into position. Jesse had just enough time to shout a warning before the devastating weapon opened fire, stitching a line of destruction across the front of the house. "Fall back!" he yelled to Sawyer and Claiborne. "To the barn, now!" They retreated through the house as bullets tore through walls and furniture, decades of memories reduced to splinters in seconds. Jesse paused only to trigger the final defensive measure, a charge of dynamite placed beneath the porch steps. The explosion rocked the night, sending a geyser of water and mud into the air and temporarily silencing the Gatling gun. In the confusion, the three men slipped out the back door and sprinted for the barn, keeping low to avoid the sporadic gunfire that still flashed from the tree line. They made it inside just as a new volley erupted, bullets thudding into the wooden walls around them. "They'll burn the house next," Sawyer predicted grimly, reloading his revolver with practiced efficiency. "Try to flush us out." Jesse nodded, moving to the back wall of the barn, where he had prepared their secondary defense. A crude system of pulleys and levers controlled the remaining irrigation channels, those that crisscrossed the fields between the barn and the creek. "Professor, are you ready with the catalysts?" he asked, glancing at Claiborne, who was hunched over a leather case containing his chemicals. "Almost," the older man replied, measuring powders with trembling hands. "This mixture is more volatile than I'd like, given the circumstances, but it should produce the effect we need." Outside, a new commotion arose, shouts of triumph, and the unmistakable crackling of flames. Through a gap in the barn wall, Jesse could see the house beginning to burn orange light, flickering behind the windows as the fire took hold. A lifetime of memories consumed in minutes. The home he had built with Eleanor, where Noah had taken his first steps, where they had laughed and loved and grieved. Gone. Strangely, Jesse felt no regret, no attachment to the physical structure itself. The house was just wood and nails. The true home, the people who had filled it with life, was what mattered. And two of those people were safe in the mountains to the east, while he and his unlikely allies prepared to make their final stand. "They're regrouping," Sawyer reported from his position near the hayloft ladder, "gathering at the north edge of the property. I count at least 20 men now." "Kane." "Can't see him, but there's someone on a white horse behind the main group. Could be him." Jesse turned back to Claiborne. "Professor, we're running out of time." "Done," Claiborne announced, straightening up with a small glass vial in his hand. "But I must warn you, once I add this to the water, we'll have perhaps 2 minutes before the reaction begins. And once it starts, it cannot be stopped." "Understood," Jesse said, taking the vial carefully. "We'll wait until they're committed to their approach, then trigger it all at once." They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, Kane's voice rang out across the property. "Blackwood, your house is gone and you're surrounded. Come out now, and I'll still honor my offer of safe passage." "He's lying," Sawyer muttered. "They'll kill us the moment we step outside." "Of course," Jesse agreed. "But they want us to believe we have a chance. That's why they haven't burned the barn yet." He moved to a small door on the side of the barn, opening it just enough to call back to Kane. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" "You don't," Kane replied frankly. "But it's a better gamble than dying in flames, isn't it?" The exchange had the desired effect, drawing Kane and his men closer to the barn, believing they were negotiating with desperate cornered prey. "Now, Professor," Jesse whispered, handing the vial to Claiborne, "add your catalyst." Claiborne uncorked the vial and poured its contents into the main irrigation channel that ran beneath the barn floor. The water, already flowing steadily from the creek, began to bubble and steam almost immediately. "Pull the levers, Mr. Blackwood," the professor urged. "Quickly." Jesse yanked the series of handles that controlled the hidden sluice gates, sending the treated water surging through the network of channels that surrounded the barn. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, as Kane and his men crossed the halfway point of the field, the ground beneath them erupted. It wasn't just water that burst forth, but a chemical reaction of extraordinary proportions. Geysers of steaming, mineral-laden liquid shot skyward, carrying with them the compounds Claiborne had added, compounds that upon contact with air ignited in bursts of blue-green flame. The effect was as terrifying as it was beautiful. The entire field appeared to be on fire, ghostly flames dancing across the surface of the suddenly marshy ground. Men screamed in panic, their horses rearing and bolting as the earth itself seemed to come alive beneath them. And in the midst of this chaos, a new sound rose, a rhythmic, pulsing boom that shook the very air. The dynamite charges Jesse had placed at strategic points along the major channels, triggered by the pressure of the rushing water, detonated in sequence, sending plumes of mud and debris high into the night sky. "My God," Sawyer breathed, watching the scene unfold. "It's like the gates of hell opening." "Eleanor's living water,"
Jesse said softly. "Protecting us even now." The attacking force broke men fleeing in all directions from the supernatural display. Even Cain, visible now on his white horse at the edge of the chaos, seemed momentarily frozen by the spectacle. "We need to move," Jesse said, turning to his companions. "The reaction won't last long, and they'll regroup once they realize it's more frightening than lethal." "Where?" Sawyer demanded. "The house is gone, and they'll burn the barn next." "The root cellar," Jesse replied. "It's stone-lined partially underground. We can hold out there until dawn." They slipped out the back of the barn, while Cain's men were still scattered, making their way through the shadows to the small mound behind where the house had stood. The entrance to the cellar was concealed by a heavy wooden door set into the hillside, easily defensible and resistant to fire. Once inside, they secured the door and took stock of their situation. The root cellar was well stocked with supplies, food, water, ammunition, and medical provisions. Jesse had moved there in preparation for just such a contingency. "How long can we hold out here?" Sawyer asked, examining the thick stone walls by the light of a small lantern. "A day, maybe 2, Jesse estimated. Long enough for Nadia and Noah to reach safety beyond the territorial line." "And then what?" the sheriff pressed. "Wade won't stop. Not while any of us live to challenge his claim to the land." Jesse had no answer to that. Their defenses had bought them time, but little more. Unless something changed dramatically, they were merely postponing the inevitable. Claiborne, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since they entered the cellar, suddenly spoke up. "There is another option," he said slowly. "One I hesitate to suggest given the risks involved." Both men turned to him expectantly. "Eleanor's research," the professor continued. "The full documentation of the water's properties. If made public, it would draw attention from scientific societies, pharmaceutical companies, government agencies. Attention Wade could not easily dismiss or control." "You're suggesting we use the research as leverage," Jesse realized. "Threaten to expose the true value of the water if he doesn't back off." Claiborne nodded. "Precisely. Wade values secrecy in his operations. The prospect of competing interests descending on this territory would be unappealing to him." "But we don't have the research," Sawyer pointed out. "You said Eleanor stored her most important findings in the bank vault." "Yes," Claiborne agreed. "But I have copies of much of her work. And more importantly, I have contacts in Denver who could publish it widely, ensuring it couldn't be suppressed." Jesse considered this possibility. It was a gamble, but perhaps their best remaining option. "How would we get word to your contacts? We're surrounded, cut off." "Not entirely," Sawyer said thoughtfully. "There's a telegraph office in Willow Creek. If one of us could reach it, through 20 armed men." Jesse shook his head. "It's suicide." "Not necessarily," the sheriff countered. "They're looking for 3 men trying to escape. One man moving carefully might slip through while they're focused on the cellar." The implication was clear. Sawyer was volunteering to make the attempt. Before Jesse could argue, the sheriff continued, "I know the territory better than either of you. I know which trails to use, which to avoid. And I have one advantage. You don't." He tapped the badge on his chest. "Not everyone in town is loyal to Wade. There are good people who will help a lawman in trouble even if they won't stick their necks out for strangers." Jesse studied Sawyer's face in the lamplight, seeing the determination there and something else. A need for redemption, perhaps for the wife he couldn't save 15 years ago. "When would you go?" he asked finally. "Now," Sawyer replied. "While they're still regrouping from the chaos at the barn. The longer we wait, the tighter their perimeter will become." It was their best chance, Jesse realized. Perhaps their only chance.
"What do you need from us?" "A diversion," Sawyer said simply.
"Something to draw their attention to the opposite side of the property while I slip out the back way."
Jesse glanced at Claiborne, who nodded in understanding. "I believe I can arrange one final chemical display," the professor said, "though I'll need to return to the barn to access my remaining supplies." "Too dangerous," Jesse objected. "They'll be watching it by now." "Not if they believe we're all still in this cellar," Claiborne countered. "A few shots fired from here at regular intervals should convince them of that." Jesse weighed the risks, then nodded reluctantly. "All right, but be careful, Professor. Your knowledge is as valuable as any of Eleanor's research notes." Claiborne smiled thinly. "At my age, Mr. Blackwood careful is a luxury I can ill afford. But I appreciate the sentiment." They spent the next hour planning the details of their desperate gambit. Sawyer would head east, following game trails through the hills until he reached the back road to town. Claiborne would create one final distraction at the barn, a chemical fire that would burn bright enough to be seen for miles, drawing Kane's men away from both the cellar and Sawyer's escape route. Jesse would remain behind, firing periodically from the cellar to maintain the illusion that all three men were still inside. As they prepared to put their plan into action, Jesse felt a strange sense of peace descend over him. They were outmanned and outgunned, their chances of success slim at best. And yet, there was a rightness to this moment. Three unlikely allies, each with their own wounds and regrets, standing together against forces that would destroy not just them, but all they held dear. "Before we do this," he said quietly, "I want to thank you both. You didn't have to join this fight. It wasn't your land, your family at stake." Sawyer shook his head. "You're wrong about that, Blackwood. This became my fight 15 years ago when I failed to stand up for what was right.
"I just didn't know it until now."
And I owed it to Eleanor," Claiborne added simply, "to honor her work, her vision for what this land could become." Jesse nodded, accepting their reasons without further comment. He checked his rifle one last time, then moved to the cellar door. "Let's begin then. Professor, you'll go first. Sheriff, wait for the signal, 3 shots in rapid succession, then make your move." Claiborne slipped out into the darkness, moving with surprising agility for a man of his years. Jesse watched until he disappeared into the shadows, then secured the door once more. "He's a brave man," Sawyer observed, "for an academic." "Aren't we all brave fools tonight?" Jesse replied with a grim smile. "Facing odds that would make sane men surrender." Sawyer chuckled softly. "Sanity's overrated, Blackwood, especially in times like these." They waited in tense silence, marking the minutes by the steady drip of water from a corner of the cellar. Jesse's thoughts drifted to Nadia and Noah, hoping they had reached the safety of the Apache camp by now, hoping they were warm and secure as the night deepened around them. Would he ever see them again? Hold his son, tell Nadia the things he had only just begun to acknowledge to himself. The odds were against it, but then the odds had been against them from the moment Eleanor died, perhaps even before that, from the moment Wade set his sights on their land. Yet here they were still fighting, still defying those odds with every breath. And somewhere in the eastern hills, Nadia was doing the same, protecting Noah with the same fierce determination that had allowed her to face the gallows without fear. They were alike in that way, he realized. Survivors who refused to surrender to forces that sought to break them. A sudden flash of light from the direction of the barn interrupted his thoughts. Claiborne's signal, the distraction, had begun. Jesse moved to the small window of the cellar, peering out at the scene unfolding across the property. The barn was ablaze, but not with ordinary fire. Green-blue flames danced along its roof and walls, casting an eerie light across the surrounding fields. Even from this distance, Jesse could hear shouts of alarm as Kane's men responded to this new development. "That's our cue," he said to Sawyer. "Ready." The sheriff nodded, checking his revolver one last time before tucking it into his holster. "Remember 3 shots in rapid succession when you want me to make my move." Jesse clasped his hand briefly. "Good luck, Sheriff. I hope we meet again in better circumstances." "Call me Robert," Sawyer replied with a faint smile. "Seems silly to stand on formality at this point." "Robert, then. And I'm Jesse." With that simple exchange, a final barrier between them fell away. They were no longer a rancher and a lawman thrown together by circumstance, but 2 men united in a common cause. Jesse moved to the door, rifle ready. He fired 2 shots toward the nearest group of Kane's men, drawing their attention to the cellar. As they returned fire, he ducked back inside, waiting for the right moment. Through the window, he could see men rushing toward the burning barn, others taking cover and aiming at the cellar. Kane himself was visible now, shouting orders from atop his white horse, the animal nervous beneath him as the unnatural fire cast moving shadows across the ground. Now Jesse decided. He raised his rifle and fired 3 shots in quick succession, the signal for Sawyer to move. The sheriff slipped out the back entrance of the cellar, a narrow tunnel Jesse had dug years ago, as an emergency exit, its outer opening concealed by a fallen log. In the confusion created by the burning barn and the gunfire from the cellar, no one noticed the solitary figure disappearing into the darkness. Jesse continued firing at irregular intervals, creating the impression that multiple defenders remained in the cellar. Between shots, he strained to see what had become of Claiborne, but the professor was nowhere in sight. Had he been captured, killed, or had he simply moved to a new position to continue his distraction? The night wore on, a deadly dance of advance and retreat, as Kane's men probed the cellar's defenses, while Jesse maintained the illusion of greater numbers with carefully timed shots. The barn continued to burn, with its otherworldly flame, casting the entire scene in a surreal, ghostly light. By the time false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jesse's ammunition was running low, and fatigue had settled deep in his bones. He had no way of knowing if Sawyer had made it safely to town, if Claiborne had escaped, or if Nadia and Noah had reached the Apache camp. All he could do was hold on, keep fighting, and trust that somewhere beyond the circle of violence that had engulfed his home, those he cared for were still alive, still carrying the hope of a future he might not live to see. As the first true light of day crept over the horizon, a new sound reached his ears, hoofbeats, many of them approaching from the direction of town. Reinforcements for Kane. Or something else. Jesse peered cautiously from the window, squinting against the growing light. A large group of riders was indeed approaching, but they weren't dressed like Kane's men. At their head rode a familiar figure, Sheriff Sawyer, his badge catching the early morning sun. Behind him came townspeople, the blacksmith, the general store owner, farmers from outlying properties, even women riding alongside their husbands. All armed, all with faces set in grim determination. And riding beside Sawyer, to Jesse's astonishment, was Judge Grant, the man who had reluctantly sanctioned his marriage to Nadia weeks ago. Kane's men had noticed the approaching force as well. They gathered around their leader, uncertain, some already backing toward their horses. "Matthias Kane," Sawyer's voice rang out across the property. "You and your men are under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and conspiracy against the citizens of this territory." Kane's laugh carried clearly in the morning air. "Under whose authority, Sheriff? You're outside your jurisdiction and outnumbered besides." "Under the authority of the territorial court," Judge Grant called back, urging his horse forward to join Sawyer. "And as for numbers, I suggest you count again, Mr. Kane." Indeed, more riders were appearing over the ridge. Farmers, ranchers, miners, ordinary people from miles around, drawn by the news that Sawyer had spread through the night, that Cornelius Wade and Bishop Harrington had conspired to murder innocent people for profit, that the same fate might await any who stood in their way. Kane's men looked to their leader, uncertainty visible even at this distance. The odds had shifted dramatically, and not in their favor. "This changes nothing," Kane declared, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Wade owns half the judges in the territory. This will be forgotten by week's end." "Perhaps," Judge Grant agreed coolly. "But in the meantime, we have telegraphed the governor with evidence of your employer's crimes, including the poisoning of Eleanor Blackwood and the framing of an innocent woman for murder. The territorial marshal is on his way, Mr. Kane. Will Wade own him as well?" A murmur ran through Kane's men at this revelation. Some were already mounting their horses, clearly unwilling to die for an employer whose protection suddenly seemed less certain. Kane himself hesitated, visibly calculating his options. Then, with a curse, he wheeled his white horse around. "This isn't over, Blackwood," he shouted toward the cellar. "Wade doesn't forget those who cross him." With that, he spurred his horse into a gallop, heading west toward the territorial border. After a moment's hesitation, most of his men followed, abandoning the siege as quickly as they had joined it. Sawyer made no move to pursue them. Instead, he dismounted and approached the cellar, hands raised to show he came in peace. "Jesse," he called, "it's over. You can come out now." Jesse emerged cautiously, rifle still ready, scarcely believing the sudden turn of events. "Robert, how did you manage all this?" Sawyer completed with a tired smile. "Let's just say there were more people in town fed up with Wade and Harrington than I realized. Once they heard what was happening out here, they didn't need much convincing to ride out." Judge Grant joined them, dismounting stiffly. "The evidence Professor Claiborne provided was compelling," he said by way of greeting. "Particularly the samples of Eleanor's poisoned tea that he had preserved. It seems the good bishop's wife was less careful in disposing of evidence than she might have been." "Claiborne," Jesse said, suddenly remembering. "Is he—" "Alive," Sawyer confirmed, "though a bit singed around the edges. He's in town being tended by Doc Morrison, said to tell you his final chemical display worked better than anticipated." Relief washed over Jesse, followed immediately by a more urgent concern. "Nadia and Noah," he said. "I need to go to them, now." "Of course," Sawyer agreed. "Take my horse. It's fresh and knows the eastern trails." Jesse hesitated, looking around at the devastation that had once been his home. The house was a smoldering ruin, the barn still burning with the last of Claiborne's chemical fire. Fields were torn up by the irrigation channels, and explosions, fences broken, years of work destroyed in a single night. And yet, none of it mattered. The land would heal. Structures could be rebuilt. What couldn't be replaced was waiting for him in the eastern hills, a solemn-eyed boy and a woman who had faced death with a song on her lips. "Thank you," he said to Sawyer, clasping his hand once more. "For everything." The sheriff nodded understanding in his weathered face. "Go find your family, Jesse. Bring them home." The ride to the Apache camp took less time than Jesse had feared. Sawyer's horse was indeed fresh and sure-footed, and Jesse pushed it as hard as he dared along the winding mountain trails. As he ascended into the higher country following landmarks Nadia had described, his mind raced with possibilities. What if they hadn't reached the camp? What if Kane had sent men after them, despite his assurances, What if? He forced the doubts away, focusing instead on the path ahead. The sun was high now, casting sharp shadows across the rocky terrain. According to Nadia's directions, the camp should be just beyond the next ridge, nestled in a protected valley near a small lake. Jesse crested the ridge, reining in the horse to survey the landscape below. The valley opened before him green and peaceful in the midday sun, and there beside the glittering water stood a cluster of structures, the remains of the Apache summer camp just as Nadia had described. His heart pounding, Jesse urged the horse forward, scanning for any sign of movement. As he drew closer, he saw them two figures emerging from one of the conical shelters, alerted by the sound of approaching hooves. Nadia stood tall and straight, a rifle in her hands, her body positioned protectively in front of Noah. Even at this distance, Jesse could see the tension in her posture, the readiness to defend the child at any cost. "Nadia," he called, waving his hat above his head. "It's me? It's Jesse." For a moment, she remained motionless, as if unable to believe what she was seeing. Then the rifle lowered, and Noah darted out from behind her, running toward him with arms outstretched. "Papa, Papa!" Jesse dismounted in a fluid motion, dropping to his knees as Noah reached him. The boy flung himself into his father's arms with such force that they both tumbled backward onto the soft grass. "You came back," Noah said, his voice muffled against Jesse's chest. "Just like you promised." "Of course I did," Jesse replied, holding his son tight, breathing in the scent of his hair, his skin, the pure essence of the child he had feared he might never see again. "I'll always come back to you, Noah. Always." He looked up to find Nadia standing over them, her face a complex mixture of emotions, relief, joy, lingering, fear, and something deeper, more profound. "You're alive," she said simply, as if stating a miracle. Jesse rose to his feet, still holding Noah. "Thanks to Sawyer Claiborne, and half the town, it seems." He took a step toward her, suddenly uncertain. So much had happened, so much had changed in the space of a single night. "Nadia, She closed the distance between them, pressing her fingers gently to his lips to silence whatever he had been about to say. "Later," she murmured. "Words can wait. For now, it is enough that you are here." And then she was in his arms, Noah embraced between them, the three of them holding each other as if they might never let go. They remained that way for a long moment, bathed in sunlight, surrounded by the ancient peace of the mountains. Then Noah wiggled free, tugging at both their hands. "Come see what Nadi showed me," he insisted, pulling them toward the lake. "The special water—" Jesse glanced at Nadia, raising an eyebrow in question. She smiled a real smile that transformed her face, erasing the worry lines that had etched themselves there during their ordeal. "It seems your wife's living water is not unique to your land," she explained, as they allowed Noah to lead them forward. "There is a spring here feeding the lake with similar properties. My mother's people knew of it for generations. They called it the healing water. That's why they established the camp here," Jesse realized. "Why the location was kept secret from outsiders." Nadia nodded. Eleanor must have learned of it during her studies with the indigenous healers. Perhaps she recognized the same properties in the creek on your land. They reached the edge of the lake, where Noah proudly pointed to a small stream that fed into it from the rocky hillside. The water bubbled up from a spring crystal clear, but with the same faint bluish tint that characterized the creek at home. "I drank some," Noah announced. "It made my tummy feel better." Jesse looked to Nadia, alarmed, but she shook her head reassuringly. "The water is safe," she said, "especially here at its source. Your son was brave during our journey, but the climb made him a little sick. The spring water helped, as it has helped my people for countless years. Jesse knelt beside the spring, dipping his hand into the cool water. It felt somehow different from ordinary water, more vibrant, more alive. He understood now why Eleanor had been so fascinated, so determined to understand its properties.
"What happens now?" Nadia asked quietly as Noah splashed happily at the lake's edge.
"The house is gone. The land." "We rebuild," Jesse said, simply rising to face her. "The land is still ours. Wade's men have fled, and evidence of his crimes has been telegraphed to the governor. He won't dare move against us openly now. And Harrington, under house arrest in town, according to Sawyer. His wife confessed to delivering the poisoned tea to Eleanor, hoping to save herself from prosecution." Jesse's expression hardened briefly at the memory, then softened as he looked at Nadia. "But that's all in the past now. What matters is what we build from here." "We," Nadia repeated a question in her voice. Jesse took her hands in his, holding them gently but firmly. "Yes, we. If you'll stay, not because of a bargain made at the gallows or out of gratitude for saving Noah, but because—" He hesitated, the words suddenly difficult to find. "Because I want you with us. Because Noah needs you. Because I—" Again she stopped him with a touch to his lips. "I know," she said softly. "And yes, I'll stay. Not out of obligation or necessity, but because I have found what I never thought to find, again a place to belong. A family." The word hung between them, perfect in its simplicity. Family. Not bound by blood or law, but by choice, by shared struggle, by the deep connections that form when souls recognize each other across the divisions of race and circumstance. Noah returned to them, wet and laughing, throwing himself into their embrace once more. "Can we go home now?" he asked, looking up at both of them with those solemn eyes that had seen too much for one so young. Jesse glanced at Nadia, who nodded. "Yes, little one," she said, smoothing his damp hair. "We can go home." As they prepared to leave the Apache camp, gathering the few supplies they had brought, Jesse noticed something unexpected. Tiny blue flowers blooming along the path from the spring to the lake. They were unlike any he had seen before, with delicate star-shaped blossoms that seemed to glow in the sunlight. "What are these?" he asked Nadia, pointing to the flowers. She knelt to touch one gently. "My people call them spirit flowers," she explained. "They grow only where the healing water flows. It is said they appear when the spirits approve of those who visit the sacred spring." "Are they always here?" "No," Nadia replied, her voice soft with wonder. "I've never seen them before. My mother spoke of them, but said they were rare, appearing perhaps once in a generation." Jesse looked from the flowers to Noah, who was carefully picking one to show to his teddy bear, and then to Nadia, her face illuminated with a joy he had thought he might never see again. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps it was simply the right season, the right conditions for these particular flowers to bloom. Or perhaps it was something more, a blessing from whatever powers watched over this ancient place, an affirmation of the path they had chosen together. Whatever the explanation, as they rode away from the Apache camp, Noah securely in front of Jesse, while Nadia led the pack horse, the image of those blue flowers stayed with him, a reminder that even in the most barren landscape life finds a way to flourish, that beauty can emerge from struggle, and that sometimes, against all odds, a family can bloom in the most unexpected places. They would rebuild the house, replant the fields, continue Eleanor's work with the living water, guided now by Nadia's knowledge of its healing properties. And they would do it together, drawing strength from each other as they had during the darkest hours of the night just past. the road ahead would not be easy. Wade's influence would not disappear overnight, and prejudice ran deep in the territory. But they had survived the storm, emerging stronger and more united than before. As they crested the final ridge before descending toward the ranch, Jesse reined in his horse, wanting to give Nadia and Noah their first view of what awaited them. The house was indeed gone, the barn a blackened skeleton, the fields torn and muddy from the night's battle. But already people were there, townspeople, neighbors, even strangers drawn by the story that was spreading through the territory. They moved about the property with purpose, clearing debris, salvaging what could be saved, beginning the process of rebuilding. Sawyer stood among them, directing efforts, while Claiborne, his arm in a sling, but otherwise apparently recovered, consulted with a group of men near what had been the irrigation control point. "They came to help," Jesse said, surprise evident in his voice. "All of them."
Nadia smiled, understanding what this meant. Not just hands to rebuild walls and fences, but acceptance, community, a place for all of them in the world they had fought to preserve. "Papa, look." Noah pointed excitedly toward a patch of ground near where the porch steps had once stood. "Blue flowers like at the lake." Jesse followed his son's gesture, expecting to see some common wildflower the boy had mistaken for the spirit flowers at the Apache camp. But no, there they were unmistakable even at this distance. The same delicate star-shaped blooms growing in a perfect circle where Eleanor's garden had once been. He glanced at Nadia, who had gone very still, her eyes wide with wonder. "Is that?" "Yes," she whispered. "The same flowers. But how?" Jesse thought of the water that had flowed through the irrigation channels during the battle, water infused with minerals from the creek. Eleanor's living water carrying the same properties as the spring at the Apache camp. "Eleanor knew," he said softly. "She understood what the water could do. This was her final gift to us, to all of us." Nadia reached across the space between their horses, taking his hand. "Then we will honor it," she said, "and her memory, by using this gift as she would have wanted to heal, to grow, to bring life where there was none before." Noah, watching the exchange with those perceptive eyes of his, suddenly broke into a smile of pure joy. "We're home," he declared, as if it were the simplest, most obvious truth in the world. "All of us." And as they rode down to join the people gathered on their land, their home, Jesse knew that his son was right. After all the loss, all the struggle, all the near defeats and desperate gambles, they had found their way to something precious and rare, a place where they truly belonged, not just to the land, but to each other. The blue flowers would bloom, the living water would flow, and the family that had been forged in the flames of adversity would continue to grow stronger with each passing day. It was enough. It was everything.